Elden Ring was an undeniable smash hit. The sales from just this one game pretty much eclipsed the sales of the entirety of the Dark Souls trilogy up through 2022 when it released. According to From Software, the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC sold around 5 million units within 3 days of its launch. For any expansion sold 2.5 years after the initial release, and which is really not a standalone pack, those numbers are crazy. The wild success of Shadow of the Erdtree and the Elden Ring IP isn't just in the numbers, but in the quality of the releases. When people finally took Shadow of the Erdtree on its own terms with its crazy boss roster and Shadow Tree fragment system, what players had in their hands were some of the tightest designed dungeons and coolest bosses yet released by From Software. Elden Ring Nightreign, on the other hand, is honestly a pretty strange little spin-off. Its reveal at the 2024 Game Awards left a lot of fans scratching their heads. With only 6 months separation between the Shadow of the Erdtree and the Nightreign announcements, no one knew exactly what to expect from such a quick turnaround. We knew from the start it would be focused on co-op, that it would showcase a whole new cast of playable characters and include a boss roster with fresh faces and somehow the return of enemies from not only Elden Ring, but the Souls trilogy as well. But what would it really look like? How big of a departure would this game be from the base Elden Ring experience? What would release on May 30th would feel, at least to me, like a refreshing shift in direction for From Software's design priorities in a post-Elden Ring world. See, I think Elden Ring has set itself as sort of the pinnacle of the current Souls game format in a lot of ways. The game world was the size of the entire Dark Souls trilogy combined and provided an exploration loop that had me continually dumbfounded that there could possibly be more to find hidden away behind innocuous doors and hidden elevators. The legacy dungeons showcase some of the best of the shortcut-driven level design we've all come to love. The bosses were tuned to the absolute limit of what I think this game can handle. And the finale of the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC had me wondering, how the hell do you iterate on this? Consort Radahn was probably the most challenge I've ever experienced from the Souls games since my first run through Dark Souls 1, where I had to put the game down for several months due to these fuckers. FromSoft even sort of admitted that the game was tuned way harder by having explicitly directed players to the first handful of Shadow Tree fragments and even tuned the final boss fight down in difficulty a few weeks after launch. Now, I personally get to be one of those losers that can say, I beat the boss pre-nerf, but it was honestly such a slog that I wasn't sure I would even ever want to play this expansion again, knowing what was at the end. So, the question remains, what do you do next? Where do you go when you've literally gone up to the very doorstep of godhood? Today, I want to examine what Nightreign brings to the FromSoft catalog as the next entry in a long line of games that have achieved critical acclaim and meme status for their difficulty. I don't think it's fair to write this title off as just a simple spin-off. The reveal of Duskbloods earlier this year has shown us the kind of direction FromSoft are going in moving forward, and I think Nightreign is setting a lot of that foundation of design right here in this title. I think the larger design plan is less of a straight escalation of challenge, but more of an explorative path, a more horizontal shift rather than just making things faster and harder. This video will inevitably spoil almost every gameplay element in some way, and while the story of Nightreign is intentionally more vague and only tangentially related to Elden Ring proper, I'll be talking about some of those elements too. This video will be structured into chapters, but please skip around at your own peril. Please don't just skip to the boss stuff, guys. I worked really hard on this, guys, please. With regards to the brand new DLC, I've decided to leave that as a mostly separate chapter towards the end of the video. Nightreign, while not exactly a live service game, is one that has evolved with semi-regular content drops since its release. So I think it's kind of important to examine how the base game functions on its own and then look at how the DLC added to or changed those functions. So if I complain about weapon variety or locked night boss encounters, please don't race to the comment section right away.
This won't be easy. We face a true horror. We can't know what's coming, but we can prepare.
Nightreign is structured as a roguelike game, a genre that I only sort of recently figured out is exactly what I want out of a lot of game experiences. Enter the Gungeon, Returnal, Balatro, and most recently Ball Pit all have equally consumed my life over the past 2 years. I was initially kind of skeptical about the Souls loop being applied to this type of game, but let's be honest, FromSoft haven't steered me wrong before. The Souls loop has been distilled down from a dungeon crawl ranging from the dozens to hundreds of hours into a 45-ish minute rush mode on a repeating basic map structure. Each expedition is broken up into 3 days. Days 1 and 2 are spent exploring the map in its randomized POIs, fighting bosses and gathering loot. Defeating bosses lets you choose between 3 items, usually 2 weapons and some kind of perk or enhancement. The items also come with their own sets of perks, but they're not always ones that really benefit your build that much. Each night will culminate in a battle against a night boss from a mostly separate pool of encounters that are sourced from Elden Ring and also the Dark Souls trilogy. Night 3 is the finale, consisting of one single fight against the expedition's night boss. This structure lends itself pretty well to repeated play. Something I noticed about Elden Ring is that on subsequent playthroughs, I'd ignore many caves and even some larger dungeons if I knew the loot wasn't very good there. I'd focus on the main shard-bearing bosses in their respective legacy dungeons. Then I'd explore a handful of other zones if they had more rewarding loot or if the level design was particularly fun to play through again. Conversely, in Nightreign, every point of interest is randomized on new expeditions, which makes each route fairly unique. The one constant location, the center castle, has a rotating cast of mob enemies and bosses that can spawn, though they'll always be scaled to higher levels than standard points of interest. Day 2 of every expedition also causes formidable field bosses to spawn around the map, giving skilled teams the chance to fight for even better loot and higher XP rewards to ensure that you can max out your level before the finale on Day 3. Even after dozens of hours, I'm still really caught off guard by the speed at which time passes for each day. Day 1 and 2 take about 15 minutes before you're facing the next night boss, but this means any time wasted can be a massive hindrance to your progress. You could run for a full minute to a formidable boss on Day 2, get halfway through the fight, and just get absolutely wrecked, losing XP but also losing precious time. Maybe your squad just tries to truck through and hope the juice is worth the squeeze, but often it isn't, and you'll find yourself coming up on the end of the night with honestly not enough XP to get to the next level. To offset the really fast night cycle, all characters move faster than in Elden Ring and have unlimited sprint outside of boss combat. Fall damage is fully gone, and players can mantle up most short cliff faces and low walls. For longer travel, Spirit Springs and Spectral Hawk points are dotted throughout the map to help you cross those large distances a lot faster. These don't fully solve the problem, but they do make life just a little bit easier during your run. There's also even further alterations to the map that can occur semi-randomly that add even more variety to what really is one single recurrent map. Field encounters appear in the form of some of those Day 3 bosses showing up on the field mid-expedition. They'll often inflict some kind of debuff that'll encourage you to either seek out this fight or trap you in some way into forcing you to fight. Completing these encounters always removes said debuff and gives a lot of XP and powerful rewards to compensate players for the time it might take to deal with these more challenging foes pretty unexpectedly. My personal favorite mechanic that keeps things really fresh is the rotation of shifting earth encounters. Each of these encounters causes a massive alteration to the map, sometimes encompassing nearly a quarter of the total area, with brand new zones that function like separate raids. There's often some kind of debuff or added challenge to the area, but with massive loot rewards and XP if you manage to finish that raid. Timing is crucial for these encounters, often taking almost all of Day 2 to complete, even if your team plays super efficiently, but the rewards are almost always worth it. I'll talk more in detail about those specific shifting earth encounters later, but that's a mostly big bird's eye view of the core gameplay loop that you're going to be following on almost every expedition. Even with all the changes to the structure of gameplay made in Nightreign, I think a lot of the core gameplay loop is pretty similar to Elden Ring. The dungeons are smaller, but the boss encounters aren't super new, and a lot of the enemies will be familiar if you've played Elden Ring before. I think Nightreign's biggest departure from the standard FromSoft experience is the decision to focus the game design on co-op. Now, before you rush to the comments, yes, of course, you can play the whole thing solo. The game is actually quite easy to break if you're playing solo, since the health of night bosses is scaled down with player count being reduced to 1. A raider or even recluse with the right relics can absolutely dominate every single boss solo. But while you can play the game this way, I think you'd be deliberately choosing to miss out on a huge part of the intended experience. That intended experience being finding other expeditioners to join you on your journey. In the lore of the game, all of these characters have been brought to the Round Table Hold with the same objective, to defeat the Night Lord and banish the night and all of its sinister forces. At no point are you told to do that alone. No one character of the bunch is the main character. Yeah, the Wilder's on the front of the box, but he's just being a show-off here. Don't worry about that. I think this change has been one of the more divisive to come along with Nightreign. For years, fans of the series have been told that summoning is a lesser experience, that a boss defeated with a little help is an entire encounter cheated. Even though nearly every game besides Sekiro has incorporated summoning other players and NPCs. Elden encouraged summoning even more and made it even easier and more powerful with Spirit Ashes and particularly the Mimic tier. And yet, there's still such a large vocal portion of the fan base that sees this experience as lesser. Me? I love summoning. I always have. Don't get me wrong, I love Sekiro. It's my second most replayed of the catalog besides Bloodborne. But I really like the summoning in all of these games. In Bloodborne, especially in Elden Ring, I think managing an adventure party during an encounter is really, really fun. Learning how to manage aggro across several members, plus the increased boss health, really change up encounters in a way that I find pretty satisfying. I see an NPC or a different player go for a big attack, and I think of ways I can capitalize on a stagger or stack an additional debuff. It's a really satisfying way to play for me. I've never really loved struggling against bosses for hours and hours on end. I don't think it's wrong for people to do that and really master an encounter on their own, but for me, and I must stress, this is my opinion, I would rather use all the tools that this game gives me. Players will put down summon signs because they want to help me. NPCs become summonable because in the story, they have their own motivations for participating in the fight. I'm not saying anyone's required to summon by any means, but it seems really silly for me to take such a principled stand against the very idea that any of these fights could be enjoyed co-op. The second, and possibly equally big change, though a little more understated, is the fact that each player is embodying a character. Now I realize this seems like kind of an obvious thing, like, yeah, I'm a giant talking bird now, of course I'm a character, but just stay with me for a second. Playing as a named character was at the root of a lot of what made Sekiro a unique entry in this whole catalog. Why can't I summon? Wolf's a quiet, solitary guy, and he really acts alone. Why am I only able to use the Kusabi Maru? Because it's the weapon Wolf trained with his whole life. Members of the Ashina royal family talk to Wolf because they know him as Kuro's bodyguard, and they expect a certain set of behaviors from him. Being a specific character with explicit goals is a cornerstone of both the story and the gameplay for the entire game, all the way up to the way each ending of the game plays out. All of those ending results are ones that Wolf would consider carefully and choose from, even the Shura ending if you're feeling like a little bit of a jerk. Elden Ring might be the very complete opposite of this approach. Your character has no name and no titles. You are tarnished, just some guy that woke up in a church somewhere. And over the course of hundreds of hours, you'll amass weapons, armor, and skills to make any run-through potentially unique as a player. That accrued weapons and skills become the player character. The result of all these options mean that any character in Elden Ring could be built to pretty much melt bosses with the right equipment and stat point allocation. FromSoft had to add an entire separate method of stat scaling in Shadow of the Erdtree just to counter the fact that so many players were so far overleveled and so over-equipped that each boss could be a breeze regardless of build. Well, here in Nightreign, instead of that 200-hour perfectly curated character with all the soft-cap stats and endgame loot, I'm instead just some new guy with barely any health, and all I've got to my name is a chipped sword and a broken charcuterie board, and I'm dropping straight into combat. Instead of getting to meticulously choose how to level up stats individually across hundreds of player levels, each character you choose from can be leveled up from 1 to 15 over the course of a run, with those stats all leveling up at the same time at a rate that scales differently for each character. Guardian, for example, gets tons of stamina to block, but not a lot of FP because, well, he's a simple bird. He doesn't have time for spells. Recluse, on the other hand, gets a massive FP pool to cast spells, but barely any health to keep safe, even at the highest levels, becoming the ultimate glass cannon. Seriously, I'm not a big Recluse player because I don't usually go for spellcaster builds, but Recluse's damage output gets really insane if you build right. These characters all have their own personalities and stories to tell. The Codex has journal entries for each character to give some background and giving you optional objectives to complete in the world to progress these stories. You'll learn who these people were and oftentimes how they came to be at the Round Table Hold. It's probably the most explicit FromSoft has gotten with character stories apart from Sekiro. It's also completely optional, though the relics you can get from the remembrances are usually pretty good. So before you even set foot on the Spectral Hawk, you might be thinking you know what to expect from something with Elden Ring in the title. I know I did. But between the character choice and co-op elements, you're already a world apart from the lands between.
You only need to land one good blow to punish a fleet-footed adversary. Be relentless. That's your best bet.
Each new expedition has your hawk drop you somewhere on the outskirts of Limveld, near a handful of basic points of interest. There's always a handful of enemies to get you up to level 2, and sometimes you'll be near a church to upgrade your flask charges. From here, you and your gang have to spam map markers to plan your run and cross your fingers that you all agree, because for some reason this online co-op game doesn't have any game chat or even basic callouts or danger pings in the year of our Lord 2025. Even after the DLC release, there's no sign that any of this is being added. The closest thing the game has are the prattling pate stones, but they take so long to use, are incredibly quiet, and have no meaningful communication outside from hyping up teammates before a boss. Defeating bosses around the map lets you choose from the loot pool containing weapons that are usually geared toward your character, but unless the Erdtree's having a fun day and decides to give your wilder nothing but whips. You'll also get to choose perks like stamina boosts or an increase to your healing abilities. Every weapon you pick up has an associated perk that needs to be considered as well. Even if it's an item you wouldn't necessarily use, the perk might be good enough to bring it along. Don't do what I did at the start and just not pick up equipment that wasn't immediately useful. Fill out those equipment slots and replace them as needed. These perks can be the difference between okay runs and god-tier boss bullying funfests. If it's a perk that you absolutely do not need, tag it for one of your teammates. Unless I'm playing as Iron Eye, I never use any kind of ranged weapons, so I'll always tag those if there's one on my team or if I see some other character using bows. As time goes by, the circle of Nightreign closes in more and more, limiting possible POIs to visit and your options to loot before the first boss. I hope you got that flask upgrade. Eventually, the circle will close in on a part of the map underneath a spectral tree sapling for you to face off with the first night boss. This is usually some souped up field boss selected from a random pool of bosses from all the Souls games and Elden Ring. If your night 1 boss is the bell-brewing hunter, Lord help you. The night bosses themselves are usually pretty good. I personally appreciate getting to face off against old favorites like the Boreal Dancer and Nameless King from Dark Souls 3. They have the same movesets, but I get the impression that they're programmed to perform combos slightly differently. The Nameless King is definitely more unpredictable than I remember, with him being in Dark Souls 3, and the Dancer doesn't seem to perform the same never-ending swirly-twirly combos as much, though both of these observations may be more due to the shared aggro across my team than anything else. In any case, I think these are great additions. The Souls games have always had this feeling that different realities were butting up against each other and the fabric separating two worlds was weakening and entities were piercing the veil. And this gives that same feeling on an even grander scale. I hope this roster of throwback bosses gets added to as time goes on, outside of just the DLC release. At around 200 hours, my biggest complaint isn't their repetition, but that their encounters are locked behind specific expeditions and randomized. If anything, I don't see these bosses enough. Defeating the boss nets some pretty good loot, lots of XP, and the start of Day 2. Day 2 is a pretty good time to visit that castle in the center of the map with its higher level enemies, or look for the formidable bosses that spawned and are now visible on your map for Day 2. If any of these bosses are the Bell-bearing Hunter, I really have to strongly advise that you don't pick a fight with him, even on day 2. He's almost never worth it, and even though he can sometimes drop legendary loot, it's a really rare occurrence. It's not worth it. Go somewhere else. Night 2 ends similarly to Night 1 with a final night boss, usually with more health to match your increase in power. But at the end of this fight, you really want to be level 14 or 15 to max out your stats because it's final boss time. Before we get to boss time though, I want to take some time to talk about a patch that came out around the end of the summer as it relates to the damage inflicted by the storm after completing Night 2. At launch, and for several months after, once that Night 2 boss was defeated, oftentimes players would run out into the storm around the boss arena to farm for any straggling enemies. If they had weapons like the Bell-bearing Hunter's sword or the grafted greatsword, they might take even longer. This is because each kill increases the bonus to your stats provided by those legendary items and their associated perks. I even did this myself once or twice, and yeah, at the time, it was really worth taking the extra couple of minutes. But if you don't have the legendary item, you'll be sitting around waiting for your teammate to finish their damn side quest and get on with the Nightreign. FromSoft patched the damage inflicted by the storm to go way up after Night 2, making it impossible to do any farming after the night boss is defeated. To compensate, they increased the initial bonuses accrued by those certain legendary items so that you could still benefit from the bonus even if the item was the very last thing you got at the end of the night. I want to highlight this change as it's the developer directly responding to feedback from players about player behaviors that make things less fun for the rest of their team. And it's a change I really appreciate seeing. It shows me at least that these changes are a part of ongoing examinations of the mechanics of the game. Before the final boss, there's a small final prep room where you can level up if you have enough runes, buy some miscellaneous items from this merchant who has mastered the quiet game, and upgrade your gear if you found any smithing stones in your travels. You'll cross this big scary bridge and open the really cool big door with your 2 new best friends that takes you to an endless desert. The first time in this boss arena really wowed me. It reminded me of my first time staring down Radon in the Wailing Dunes. This desert seems to stretch on into infinity, and the only other being besides you and your dream team is a giant monster with murder on the mind. It's here that I should reiterate that that same boss health scaling from previous Souls games applies here for you and your squad. If you're playing solo, the boss has a pretty normal looking amount of health if you've built your character properly. If you've been really smart and efficient with your looting, damage numbers can get really crazy in solo. In multiplayer, the boss's health pool is just massive, causing every final boss to be a really prolonged encounter unless your whole team has peak equipment and is absolutely locked in. Each boss has a specific element they're weak to, so hopefully you focus your loot hunt on that, but good equipment isn't guaranteed even by completing those special points of interest, so your mileage will vary a lot between runs. Finishing the expedition, win or lose, nets you a handful of useful relics and some merc used as this game's currency. Fully completing the expedition nets you more relics and merc, and a boss-specific relic that sometimes has more useful perks. Rinse and repeat this cycle until your fingers fall off. Limveld as a game world is okay when it comes to variety. The rearranging points of interest and verticality of the map make traversal feel pretty fresh each time. I rarely take the same route twice except when dealing with that center castle. The point of interest elemental focuses and switching up night bosses direct you all over the map in differing paths. Formidable opponents on Night 2 add to this big handful of split-second decisions that outline each expedition. But with the set limits of the point of interest and boss pools, it would get really boring after a few of the same runs. What takes level variety from good to great is the shifting earth modifiers, altering a quarter to a third of the map with a whole separate raid scenario with potentially crazy rewards for any run. I just love these. This was the biggest question I had when watching the trailer, seeing the rot-infested woods with corpses hanging from trees and a sickly pink haze obscuring your view. Each raid zone functions as a carefully crafted legacy dungeon with certain guaranteed boss spawns and win conditions. The aforementioned rotted woods require you raid a castle deep in the heart of the rot to find a secret scarlet plant bud that not only cures the ever-present rot buildup, but actually makes the presence of rot empower you and gives you a version of Melania's Great Rune. After taking a big hit, you can hit back and recover some of your lost health. These zone buffs make clearing formidable bosses in the woods an absolute breeze. Noclateo is one of the 2 shifting earths that I consider unskippable. Navigating the Nokron-inspired streets and buildings eventually lead to a natural born of the void as its final boss. This unique boss can drop legendary loot, and the Wending Grace behind him give your whole team a get-out-of-jail-free card during the final fight. Better yet, a side path in the city has a coffin that can duplicate weapons. I didn't know about this room for weeks until an absolute saint of a teammate duplicated the grafted greatsword for me with enough time to farm up that stat bonus. These kinds of loot drops and buffs can turn the toughest encounters into absolute cakewalks. The mountaintop is only really necessary to perform when facing Caligo, especially the Everdark variant. This is one of the most drastic elevation changes for any zone in this game or even in Elden Ring proper. Navigating to the top of the mountain gives you a buff when in the presence of frost and halves incoming frost damage. Obviously, this is going to be really powerful against a big frost dragon and the frost dragon that's also at the peak of this mountain. When I'm not going up against Caligo, I actually usually skip this unless I have tons of time after looting other high priority places. Sometimes I'll just clean up the couple of mini bosses around the base of the mountain for some last minute XP. The crater is the last of the 4 raids in the base game. It's also the only other raid I consider mandatory. Where the mountain took you high above the world, the crater takes you far, far below. The volcanic crater occasionally shakes the earth and erupts hot magma above the crater line. Inside are multiple really, really hard bosses, but if you pass by them and traverse down, you lead into the ruins filled with fire prelates and multiple easier loot drops. Getting to the bottom pits you against a beefed up magma worm. A bit boring as this boss has nothing unique to differentiate him from other worms, but once defeated, the altar behind it will ascend 1 weapon all the way to legendary. This can cause some crazy damage boosts. A weapon held mostly for its perk can now do damage worthy of a Night Lord. With all the loot opportunities on the way to this altar, your chances of finding something really useful are drastically increased. I can usually finish this raid with enough time to deal with some of those surrounding bosses, but the ones you fight on your way down give lots of loot and stat bonuses to pad out your build. Each scenario will essentially determine your plan of advancement depending on how each raid reward may or may not help in that final boss fight. Most harbor the potential for legendary loot, but they also take a really big chunk of your time, sometimes taking the entirety of day 2, so there's a really interesting trade-off here. Each of the raids guarantees 1 specific final circle zone. This zone is always either within the raid area or just outside of it, making getting there really quick. You can usually farm a bit or even squeeze in 1 more boss fight before the Nightreign forces you into the final area. With the recent release of the DLC comes an entire new shifting earth, which I'm putting in massive air quotes. The Great Hollow Shifting Earth, rather than changing only 1/4 to 1/3 of Limveld, is actually an entirely new map all on its own, with its own new raid mechanic, additional enemies, and entirely new castle structures to navigate through. This addition to the game is such a drastic departure from what I think shifting earths mean that I'm going to save it for a larger discussion on the DLC towards the end of the video. Now that that's a basic look at what you'll be doing, let's take, frankly, way too much time to look in depth at whose boots you'll be using to tromp around Limveld.
I don't care to fraternize, but I know a useful ally when I see one. If the need arises, let's run wild.
The cast of characters of Nightreign has been a real shining element of this game, forcing me to approach the game in ways I never played the base game or any of the Souls games previously. I typically only ever use spells as a support to my main weapons or to stack up poise damage. Not so here. The stat scaling of each character makes certain builds or playstyles completely unviable depending on your choice. Guardians shouldn't bother with skills in most weapon arts. Revenants and Recluses probably shouldn't charge headfirst into the melee. Each character has unique or improved movesets with the given weapon type they start with. Wilders have unique greatsword swings, Iron Eye fires his bow faster. You get the idea. The Wilder is likely the first character a new player will start with. He has his greatsword and little shield to start, and a lot of the relics you can equip heavily promote the use of more greatswords in your play. He has a unique greatsword moveset, but the style of play is still pretty standard to the core Elden Ring experience. His character skill, Claw Shot, is a grappling rope that lets you zoom around arenas and make traversal just super fast if you time a jump right at the end of that grapple. It's hard for me to play as other characters after I've been Wilder for a bit because I feel like I'm going so slow if I don't have this move at my disposal. Wilder's ultimate art, Onslaught Stake, lets him summon the power of God and anime to blow up anything immediately around him and stagger almost any enemy, including a lot of bosses. One of his best in-slot relics also spreads fire on the ground where he strikes. This ult attack does really massive poise damage and is good for staggering bosses out of their really long, windy combos. All ultimate attacks give characters blanket invincibility. This has become a cornerstone of the way I approach encounters. The iframes of an ult can save you from a night boss's nuke attack if you're not confident with your dodge timing. Being able to get in close during these big attacks also gives you the possibility of staggering a boss out of a really big attack combo. Every character also has a passive ability. Wilder's lets him survive a killing strike one time. That ability needs to be reset by visiting a site of grace, so you're only going to be able to use this once during a given encounter. To me, Wilder's setup is simple because he's the introductory character. A relic actually adds an attack to his grapple ability, and a separate relic can give you 2 uses of that grapple. Nightreign wants you to be aggressive and decisive. Close the gaps, get in close, and hit enemies hard. He's still probably my favorite character because the way he moves around the map feels the closest to Sekiro of any of these characters, and Wolf's movement felt the best to me of any FromSoft title. Guardian is basically a tank character, focused on drawing aggro and blocking attacks rather than spamming dodge. If the giant shield that's as big as the Revenant was a big enough hit, his passive ability Steel Guard encourages play where you stand your ground and take the brunt of most enemy attacks. Guard counter perks and counter attack perks can make you able to retaliate. Playing as Guardian showed me something really interesting about the way guarding works in Nightreign as opposed to previous games. Blocking of any type will block all incoming damage, only wearing down your stamina depending on how strong your guard is. You don't take annoying chip damage unless it's of an elemental variety. This means Wilder's Frisbee is actually a pretty good block option if you have nothing else, but that also means you can just ditch the shields and block with your big weapon if nothing else. Dodging while holding the block button activates Guardian's passive and even further negates the stamina hits that you take by blocking. You can take multiple hits from even the Night Lord himself while in this stance. Some relics reflect minor damage back at the attacker, making you able to chip away at enemies' health without swinging your weapon at all. His character skill and ultimates are both super bird-coded, and I love them. Whirlwind knocks down most mobs around you if you get surrounded, and can even knock over bosses. His ultimate art, Wings of Salvation, cause him to fly up a bit and strike down at the ground, causing a big AoE blast that can also buff your nearby allies. This AoE can also be used to revive allies who were knocked down in the immediate area. In the end, I don't love playing as Guardian, but I have a lot of respect for people who choose him and play to his strengths. He's a really good shield to hide behind if you need a quick heal, and his ult has saved me in the final moments of certain runs. Iron Eye is a long-range support class and one that I wish got a little more love from the loot pool. Bows don't rely on ammo in Nightreign, and Iron Eye can shoot bows faster than other characters. However, the late-game bows are way less common than other weapon types. You'll probably be running a heart bow until late game or even up to the final boss. Great bows lag really far behind because of their long draw time, and crossbows are fine, but they don't seem to outclass bows, again because of their long reload time. Iron Eye's character skill marks enemies on one of those points you can lock onto with your targeting. Doing enough damage breaks the sigil for massive damage and possibly a stagger if you get lucky. His ultimate, like Wilder, also summons the power of God and anime and shoots the target with a whole separate giant bow he pulls out of his ass, dealing massive damage and creating a small AoE for nearby targets. While dealing damage from a distance is typically safer than a melee engagement, most bosses can close gaps really quickly, so drawing aggro can be a pretty big risk. That being said, there's a pretty sick combo that can put some distance between you and the boss, where you activate his character skill to mark and get behind the target, then activate the ult from a safer spot to deal big damage for the sigil mark. It also looks really cool, and the character skill provides enough iframes to keep you out of any nearby danger. Good Iron Eye builds also kind of require perks that extend damage drop-off distance, allowing you to keep a greater gap between you and foes. Without these perks, the damage falloff is a really big problem. During boss fights you have to be so close to make any real headway. Bows already have a pretty low DPS compared to other weapon types, so you really can't afford to lose any damage by being too far away. Overall, I do really enjoy this character because you can just consistently chip away at health bars and apply status effects, but the constant shooting can get really repetitive. It's the most fun bows have ever been in the Souls series, but it still wears thin faster than the other characters' playstyles. The Duchess is where things start to get pretty weird and deviate from the more traditional styles of play for the Souls series. Duchess is a semi-secret character not immediately available. When I first unlocked her, I thought she'd end up being my favorite character for her skill alone, Restage. It repeats all attacks and status buildups inflicted on an enemy for the last few seconds at a lowered percentage of the total. This skill can be activated in the middle of any other animation, attacks, dodging, anything you want. This makes her a really good support to an executor applying bleed or when trying to stagger a boss by stacking damage from a character's ultimate attack. Her health bar leaves a lot to be desired, but that's helped by her passive ability, which adds a double dodge animation for next to no stamina. Duchess can dodge all over the place, and the additional iframes make her almost impossible to hit. Her ultimate leaves a bit to be desired, but it's not that terrible either. Finale does a little twirl and makes her, along with nearby allies, invisible. This is good to hit during nuke attacks because you'll be safe from the damage due to the iframes, and any downed allies are way easier to revive when you're invisible for a few seconds. She gets unique animations for daggers, which are the primary weapons of choice for her best builds, but with an A scaling in intelligence and a B in faith, it's also not a bad idea to have at least one staff or talisman with you for even more support. My preference for characters is largely based on feel rather than their raw damage potential. Along with Wilder, Duchess is probably my favorite to play from the base game. There's just something really satisfying about zipping all over arenas, spamming a few hits on enemies to cause status effects, and it's also kinda neat to find out via the codex that her and Wilder are siblings. I don't know, I just think she's kinda neat. Raider is a character I thought I would love, but ended up just not vibing with at all. After gravitating toward dual colossal weapons in Elden Ring, I figured Raider would be the character of choice to keep that train going. With an essence strength scaling and midline stats other than just health, this seemed accurate on paper. But my time with Raider felt akin to shoveling gravel. His unique animation set pertains to great axes, and while he does a lot of damage per hit, each swing feels a quarter to a half second too long and has really strange arcs, resulting in me missing a lot of my swings. His character skill, Retaliate, makes him do a flurry of barehanded strikes that deal decent damage and stagger potential, but these never really felt good to use for me. I never felt like it was the right time to use them like I do with other character skills. It always felt like I was trying to shoehorn the skill into encounters and it just never really clicked. His passive just increases the damage dealt by Retaliate when you use that skill and prevents knockdowns. It seems like he gets some kind of hyper armor, but again, this isn't something I could really feel during regular play. Raider's ult is one of the more interesting ones, which summons the giant totem at his feet and becomes a climbable object for allies, and it also provides a 15% damage boost if you're near it. It does significant damage to enemies that get caught in the summon, and the totem can give you a rare chance to revive downed allies while you have aggro. In my experience though, Raider's swings are so slow that even staggering a boss with the totem doesn't reliably give you a long enough window for a full revive, especially if more than one of your teammates are down. The biggest upside to me is his health bar. He has the second highest health, so you can really take some punishment with how close you'll be getting to these bosses. I wouldn't say Raider is frustrating, and with the right build he becomes quite the strength powerhouse, but he's probably my least favorite Nightfarer of the bunch. Like with Guardian, he's not my Nightfarer of choice, but whenever I see one on my team, I get a pretty good idea of how they're going to play, and they usually excel with what the Raider does. At least you can cosplay as the Onion Knight. That helps a bit. Recluse required a big mindset shift to me in how I approach magic gameplay. I typically would only ever use magic as a support to my class in Elden Ring, and only dedicated maybe one flask for FP restoration. In Nightreign, there are no cerulean flasks. If you don't find any Starlight Shards, your FP for a given encounter is a strict limit outside of some very specific weapon perks. Recluse is the exception to this limitation. Her character skill allows near infinite replenishment of FP along with collecting something called Residue. Residues would change based on what damage enemies have taken, and sometimes what damage those enemies are actually dealing. Collecting 3 lets you spend the residues to create a cool magic cocktail, the effect of which depends on what combination of residues you've collected. Some effects do crazy damage, and others don't seem to do much of anything in practice. Collecting residues in a synergized way is one of the main challenges to playing Recluse effectively. When I first tried out the class, I kinda just spammed the cocktail so that I could start collecting residues again and replenishing my FP. By later rounds, I had learned at least a couple combos that I preferred, but one of them required lightning residue, which can be a little uncommon depending on the kits of your allies. In general, for more important boss fights, I found focusing on residues too much to be a pretty hefty distraction. Along with FP replenishment, Recluse's best support option is the ultimate attack Soul Blood Song. This deals moderate damage and marks any nearby enemies with a sigil. Attacking marked enemies replenishes both health and FP. It's a really good way to both revive downed allies and help them gain back health without wasting a flask, similar to Guardian's ult. While Recluse can be a really great support to a team and an absolute DPS powerhouse, this class suffers the most by far from loot inconsistency. Recluse is the poster child of the glass cannon build. With the right staff or even a single spell, I've seen a Recluse completely melt even the Night Lord. The problem is that regardless of staff, spells are randomized. This is a really strange departure from every other character so far. If Wilder gets the same sword in 3 separate loot drops, they might have different affinities, they're probably going to have different weapon arts, but the sword is going to swing the same way each time. It's going to do roughly the same damage each time as well. Not so with Recluse. Each staff comes with just 2 random spells mapped to the light and heavy attack button. Because the spells are totally random, each staff could fundamentally change the swing of your attack. You could find a purple staff with a great perk, but only Glintstone Pebble and a random buff that takes too long to cast or even be useful. As a side note, something I found really frustrating about playing is that because the spells are fully random and not intrinsically light or heavy attacks, I've had runs where one staff will have a spell as a light attack, and another staff will have that same spell mapped to heavy. So I'd be swapping staffs to try and mix up spells, and I'd end up using the wrong one because in this little box, all the staffs and spells look the same. Thank God Recluse can recover FP because I seem to be adept at wasting it. Executor might end up as your favorite Nightfare if you really miss Sekiro and would do anything for another parry system, or love aura farming during boss fights. Executor is a weird one for me. He has the second lowest starting health tied with Duchess. His S-rank skills are Dexterity and Arcane, so okay, he's really good with katanas and proccing bleed and other status effects. That's pretty sensible as he's clearly a katana user, but you should really only use dex-based weapons. His low health is compensated for with his abilities. His character ability Suncatcher can actually perform a Sekiro-like deflect. Repeated deflects make the blade glow and do more damage, and even a cool little finishing move that does really crappy damage for how cool it looks. The blade also has a decent block. Perfect parries also do poise damage and can eventually stagger a boss for a nice riposte. As far as I can tell, any attack can be deflected, even AoEs and Night Lord nukes. Deflecting the Night Lord's bomb does prove really satisfying if you get the timing right. His ult also might be the best in the game just for its versatility. You unleash your inner alpha and become a giant crucible beast. The beast form grants you a full heal with an extended health bar and comes with a ton of new attacks. These attacks don't do crazy damage, but it makes you a real big damage sponge that can take a lot of punishment if you want to prioritize healing your teammates. This can be pretty deadly in boss fights since you can stagger easier than you'd hope for, but in day 1 and 2 it's pretty useful. So why don't I like this guy as much as I thought I would? He's actually the first one I used during solo runs. Katanas were one of the main metas of Elden Ring, and I can parry like in good old Sekiro. This one was a bit of a head scratcher at first, but I've come to realize Executor is just a way more situational character than I might have thought initially. He's pretty bad at keeping aggro since his Curse Blade only allows walking. He doesn't apply a lot of stagger since he mainly uses dex weapons, and without a Duchess to stack the status effect buildups, you often can't proc your best effects on final bosses. I find this character is an aura farming honeypot. He's really not good at reliably rezzing teammates without the use of his ult, and his ult makes him a massive damage magnet during fights. He'll be stuck as the final one alive and having to parry non-stop without being able to dish out a ton of damage in return. I used him to beat the Night Lord once for the trophy, and that win was more by luck, both in the fight and from the loot drops. In that run, I obtained 2 legendary weapons and a Wending Grace. Where I feel like the Wilder gets a really good spread as a jack-of-all-trades DPS, Executor is spread to like 3 different niches that are all too situational to be my favorite. I'm sure some of you might comment and say he's your favorite, and I don't know, maybe I just need to spend more time with him, but man, something really felt off with this one. Revenant is probably the weirdest of the bunch, and somehow made an impression as one of my favorites. I think this might be that in my quest to beat the Night Lord with every Nightfarer, hers probably took me the longest, so I ended up getting to spend way more time with her than I was planning to. Let's get into what the heck happened here. First, I like summons. I think they're a great support, and she gets 3 to add to the team, but only using 1 at a time. Her ult makes everyone nearby temporarily immortal, including those summons. You can end up at 1 HP, but you won't go down for about 30 seconds or so. This ult not only reses downed allies from a surprising distance, but causes those summons to perform an ultimate move of their own. While Revenant can't replenish FP like Recluse, she does get an absolutely massive FP pool, an S in Faith, and B rank in Arcane and Intelligence, so not only is she a great caster, but status effects have quick build up too. Pair this with any number of bonuses that cause FP replenishment and you become a lightning throwing machine. Her starting claws are actually one of her best possible weapons, especially when upgraded. They do frostbite damage and have a ton of variable range. When I would watch other players use these, I didn't think I'd like them, but something about them just felt really good to use. The claws, combined with incantations, especially Lightning Spear and Black Flame, were just so punchy. Flame of Frenzy just absolutely melts large bosses if you get up close for the cast. Doing damage afar while the summons get up close and help stagger bosses even more turns out to be a really fun loop. Speaking of summons, they're not just a friend to Revenant. They'll sometimes draw aggro from teammates and will even attempt to revive them if they get downed. I don't know if there's a way to manually trigger this, and it does seem kind of inconsistent in my experience being on the receiving end of the revive, but it's better than nothing, I guess. Overall, these have all been pretty fun to play. Just gonna throw a ranking up on the screen for people to argue about. Just know, I don't think any of these are awful, but with a limited number in the base game, there's definitely some I'm not gonna be playing probably ever after finishing this project.
Now we strike at the head of the serpent. Should we prevail, victory will finally be ours. Can't be too hard, can it?
In my mind, bosses fall loosely into 3 categories: point of interest bosses, field bosses, and final bosses. Field bosses can be found in a handful of places around Limveld, but can also appear at the end of Nights 1 and 2. So let's look at all these categories in what's probably going to be annoying detail. Every point of interest on the map has a given low-level boss. That boss is largely predictable based on the elemental icon shown on the map. Deathblight ruins will always have a giant tentacle face, and Sleep ruins will have root bears for some reason. Some ruins will have 2 potential boss types, like ones based around frost or holy damage. Whether that POI is a ruin, a castle, or a crumbling cathedral, it's usually pretty predictable what that encounter is going to be. The actual bosses themselves don't matter too much. They're really just standard enemies from Elden Ring with a slightly bigger health bar. They're usually not too hard, even the rune bears to be honest. And that lower difficulty is reflected in a lower XP reward and a more basic loot pool. It's a good idea to go to a couple of these at the start to try and get something with the boss weakness element, but once you've done a couple or are above level like 5, it's not super worth your time to go to any of these. A step up from POI bosses are field and Everjail bosses. Both sets of these are pretty much unpredictable until you're already there in the middle of the encounter. They're always a gamble between something like a single Crucible Knight or an entire Deathrite bird. These fights are more fun, more challenging, and have a higher reward potential. The approach to field bosses can take some split-second decisions. An Airtree avatar is pretty easy regardless of level, but a Bell-bearing hunter will almost always be too hard to be worth it. And remember, even if you think you know all his moves, his wide swings and fast aggro switches also mean your teammates might be more vulnerable. You just sort of have to hope your team can communicate well enough to engage efficiently or to cut your losses and run away. Something extra about these field bosses that I find kind of annoying is that if they get far enough from their own spawn, they'll just disappear and go back. This completely breaks the flow of the fight and forces a run back. At least their health stays down, but this happens a lot to me when fighting magma worms and dragons due to their attacks involving a lot of travel around open fields. Also, amazingly, sometimes these field bosses can interfere with Everjail fights. This Everjail is always just a little too close to this field boss spawn. Even if you don't leave the circle of the Everjail, some of those bosses, like the fucking Bellberry Hunter again, can aggro as they walk around the area and see you. And this Everjail isn't outside of their bounds, so unless you want to fight 2 bosses at once, you either have to run away until they respawn or hope that they lose aggro. It's not an impossible situation, but remember, your time and resources are really limited. A big relic meta is to take this relic that boosts damage for each Everjail completed and gives you one free key. But even then, those keys are a finite resource and can require farming unless all 3 players have the same relic. So if you come in and use up one of those precious keys on an Everjail guarded by Captain Fuckstick, you've lost a lot of time, an essential resource, a stat level if anyone dies mid-fight, and the chance to gain a permanent damage bonus. Now, that's definitely just a part of the risk-reward of playing this game, and it can make for a really fun gamble, if you're level 2 and get paired up against a whole ass dragonkin that takes up your whole screen. That's just the RNG I love about this game. But the handful of edge cases where I'm getting ganked by a whole separate boss don't feel super fun sometimes. These field and Everjail bosses can be used as night bosses for day 1 and 2. I won't go into painful detail about these because all of them are enemies that are present in the Elden Ring base experience. You've seen these guys before. You should probably know their moves too. It does feel like their movement has been altered to accommodate the generally smaller and unpredictable final boss arena. Before we move on from field encounters and get into the really meaty Nightlord bosses, there's 3 things I want to bring up here that are sorta weird and didn't really fit anywhere else. The list of bosses that can appear at the end of Night 1 and 2 are a set list depending on what Nightlord you're facing. This is honestly kind of baffling to me in the long run. Maybe FromSoft wants to encourage facing other unpopular Nightlords, but the spread isn't even. The Nameless King is only available for Dark Drift Knight in the night aspect, while the Centipede Demon is available for 4 of those Nightlords. It's just really strange to me at this point in the game's life to limit the encounter potential like this. The presence of former bosses from the Souls games was a specific advertised feature of Nightreign. It would obviously be better for RNG if all bosses were available for all raids, given that this is the only thing close to a boss rush experience we have in this series outside of Sekiro or PC mods. The Golden Hippopotamus is present as a field boss and possible Night 2 boss that's paired alongside a Crucible Knight. This is, as far as I can tell, the only Shadow of the Erdtree content present in the entire base game, and I cannot for the life of me figure out why. This boss was definitely really low on my personal ranking of the Shadow of the Erdtree bosses, and this one doesn't even have the Porcupine Phase 2 attacks. Why not just have the full multi-phase fight from the DLC and ditch the Crucible Knight altogether? Why not have more Shadow of the Erdtree content than just the one boss that's kinda boring? I really don't see a reason for this to have worked out the way it did. There were other enemies from the base game they could have included, or they could have pulled another old favorite from Dark Souls. Or better yet, just put in more Shadow of the Erdtree content, please. Third, and finally, if you beat the Night 2 boss, something really weird can happen. You'll get a message that says, the Night threatens us anew, and a whole extra boss will appear to fight you. This has only happened one time to me, and I don't even have good footage of this because I wasn't planning on recording this run, and I was caught super off guard when this happened. This is kind of awesome as a possible random event. Am I annoyed that the extra boss was a goddamn Deathrite bird and not something more interesting? Yeah, a little. If this happened more often and I got more chances to experience this event, I'd feel a little more positive here. Like maybe 1 in 10 runs triggers this event, or if your team uses less than 2 flasks per player, something to add extra challenge maybe? Those are just some armchair ideas, I don't know. I've also done some reading that says that this can only happen on certain Nightlords like Adele or Fulgor, so I don't know. I don't even remember what Nightlord I was fighting when I was going up against this. Okay, now it's time for the big ones. The final Nightlord bosses. And it only took us like a full hour to get here. The first boss every player must get past is Gladius, Beast of Night. This boss is the gate before the rest of the game to encourage cooperative play. If you're playing solo, this pretty manageable fight against a large Cerberus switches to a triple gank fight where one of the dogs retains the sword and the other 2 will pounce on you and belch fireballs on you constantly. If you have a full team, that aggro gets pulled away from you, so it's not a full gank. The 3 dogs seem to aggro at the same level, so drawing aggro applies individually. Sometimes you'll have all 3 dogs on you, sometimes you'll have 2 on you and one changes its mind, which distracts you while the other lunges from way too far away and knocks you down. The dogs do roar, but their lunges are really quiet actually, and with the music blaring, it's really hard to tell when they're coming, so lock on at your own risk. A really awesome element of the fight, and honestly all fights, is the arena. These rolling dunes will be the primary battlefield for every Nightlord, with the background and coloration being the only major change to that arena set dressing. The rolling dunes can occasionally create a height differential between you and incoming attacks, causing the long sweeps with the chainsword to go right over your head, no dodge required. Gladius has the most generous grab attack of any Night Lord, or really any enemy period. Grab attacks work slightly differently here than in previous Souls games in Elden Ring. For most of the series, you just have to know which windups and animations meant that the enemy was performing a grab attack, where merely touching them would cause the attack to land. In Nightreign, there's a super distinct audio cue and purple aura during the windup. For Gladius, all 3 heads perform this windup in a rhythm. No other boss performs a grab attack this generously. It's just one purple flourish and then it's time to dodge. This animation set also seems like a teaching moment. It looks really cool with each head acting almost independently, but it feels more like that teaching moment in hindsight to get you to learn when to dodge grab attacks. If this Cerberus creature was an Elden Ring boss, without the ability to split and reform, I think it's pretty fun. The mix of flowing sword sweeps, quick lunges, and fireballs are a really fun mix of attacks. It feels like the Red Wolf of Radagon with a dash of Sif, like if Kratos and his Blades of Chaos were in dog form. Actually playing this on launch day turned out to be more frustration than anything. Gladius is an entrance exam, but I don't think the lessons it teaches give the best impression of what's to come. Even with the elemental weakness to holy damage, it's really not clear what that damage is doing, and the numbers boost feels pretty negligible. Trying to parse these little symbols by the boss health bar while also fighting that boss isn't kind to a new player. The constantly changing aggro of the night boss is way more unpredictable than what future bosses will hold. In the end, the best part about beating Gladius was the knowledge that I could now fight literally anything else. If you, like me, made the unfortunate mistake of scrolling one boss down and going, yeah, that looks fun, get ready for a kind of bad time. Well, okay, not an awful time. Initially, when I saw this brick shithouse stomp onto the scene, I thought, oh, awesome, a dragon fight, I love those. And I really do. I think FromSoft has some really kick-ass dragon fights, and Adele looked absolutely creepy with its twisted mouth. This gaping maw feels reminiscent to the gaping dragon from Dark Souls 1, his head twisting itself apart as he thrashes around in a pained rage. Unfortunately, the vibes are where my enjoyment of this boss start and end. Basically, all of Adele's attacks are on my list of challenging in a boring way. Adele will stomp away and whip around and lunge, with its massive mouth being a super large and kind of unclear hitbox. It'll also spam grab attacks that not only drain a ton of health, but also will apply bleed. Unless you have a team close enough to take advantage of the opening this provides to stagger Adele out of the grab attack, you're gonna get knocked down when he's done crunching you. His weakness is one of those other elemental teaching moments, and honestly, his weakness is one of the weirder ones. I'm not used to dragons being weak to poison elements, but here comes this one big boy to change my mind. Proccing poison causes Adele to stop and start vomiting all over the ground, leaving a really large opening for follow-up attacks. I've had the most success with an Iron Eye on the team just spamming poison arrows all day long while melee characters keep him distracted. Phase 2, somehow, gets even more annoying. With an animation that admittedly looks cool as hell, Adele infuses itself with lightning and it'll start stomping around even more. They'll throw tantrums, and that stomping will cause lightning to form in a giant aura around the arena that you just have to run away from. A lot of the bigger Phase 2 attacks require that running away rather than a dodge timing due to camera limitations. Bringing up that limitation sorta speaks to the larger issue with this fight. In order to stay in safe zones during attacks, you spend a lot of time in a position where you can't really see what the boss is even doing. You could be dodging close by the legs to deal damage, and Adele will just start stomping like a brat, and you'll just have to eat that damage. If you're a lower HP character, this could mean a fatality, or just leaving very little HP to deal with any kind of follow-up attack. Both phases are just so full of these grab and slam attacks that I have a hard time enjoying this. There's a really erratic flow to the fight that rarely feels good. With the right team and build, Adele is actually one of the more manageable bosses, since you can just outpace Adele's damage with your own, but that still doesn't feel like mastery. Brute forcing works, but without a good flow, this is another boss I rarely come back to. Oh, and spoiler for the Everdark section, but this later form is even more annoying, but we'll get there, don't you worry. Sentient Pest isn't the worst duo boss fight of the series, but it's far from the best. Phase 1 is both the giant bug boys being fully separate. You can fight the scorpion creature that's fully on the ground, or you can try to chase down Mothman for occasional hits. Melee builds are more likely to take on the big beefy Scorpion Boy, and ranged attacks will have an easier time with the Moth since its attacks are really easy to avoid and punish. For my money, I spend most of my time against the Scorpion. Even playing ranged builds, it's kind of boring against the Moth because he just doesn't do a whole lot, and his telegraphs are really obvious. Even the Poison Mist really rarely has a chance to proc. Now, even though I prefer fighting the Scorpion between the two of them, that's not to say I find it super fun. Most of the Scorpion's phase 1 attacks are slams that pick directions seemingly at random. He'll raise up on his legs and pick whether he wants to slam left or right. If you and a teammate are on either side of him, time to flip a coin and see who gets smacked. Those slams also produce rocky spikes even if you think you're out of range, and have a slight delay from the strike, leading to mistimed dodges if you think you're in the wrong damage zone. I find that Guardians aren't as useful as you'd think for these types of attacks. The lowered stamina cost of blocking is nice when faced with the slams, but a lot of these attacks cause a knockback animation, especially when you block those heavier slams. You might not get fully staggered, but getting pushed back prevents you from being able to perform a counterattack. Sometimes, for some reason, the Scorpion King likes to hunker down and turn pale and rocky, negating almost all damage so all characters have to focus on fighting Mothman. But don't look away too long because he'll randomly decide he's ready to fight again. Like a kid who says time out right before getting tagged and then wonders why no one wants to play with him, you little dork. While all of this is going on, Mothboy will spend the whole time spreading his poison cloud around and occasionally firing off magic blasts. Phase 2 is a little more interesting, but the same amount of annoying. Mothman sits on Scorpion King's head and they begin to attack together. When the phase starts, and then a few more times during the fight, Scorpion will charge you down while the Moth casts its magic attack straight ahead. It's not that hard to avoid, but it does a truckload of damage. Mothy continues to blast out his cloud and magic attacks, but now he's even harder to see. Now you have to fall to the triple threat of get distracted by the filling poison bar, get smacked by Scorpion while poison proccing, then get hit by a magic attack you didn't see coming because Beefcake over here was taking up your whole goddamn screen. Bringing fire weapons becomes invaluable for exploiting the elemental weakness. You can theoretically stagger the Noster duo if you're really persistent, but there's not actually an opening for a critical, which sucks because a few extra seconds of vulnerability would be kinda nice given you really can only damage one of the enemies during this phase. But there's a very situational silver lining here. When the boss is staggered, Mothy will drop down low enough to be damaged by certain high swinging attacks. If you bring a weapon with the Eruption art and use it during the stagger, the small AoE and fire damage hits both enemies at the same time. With the elemental vulnerability and the multi-target hit, you can usually squeeze off two of these attacks that the pair just have to sit in for absolutely massive damage. This move causes the health bar to just melt away, honestly. I feel like this effect would be similar for other lava AoE attacks like certain spells or maybe the Fire Giant's whip art, but those are even rarer drops, so I didn't have the chance to try any of those out. Overall, after a couple of runs, I actually kind of like this fight. The music and the overall vibe here is really great and unique compared to previous Souls bosses. The biggest hangup for me actually isn't the hard to see attack patterns. I mean, look, there's enough of those in this game that I don't really hold it specifically against Noster. For me, it's that the boss feels really tanky for a duo outside of those specific stagger punishments I mentioned. Even using fire weapons on the staggered enemy just feel really spongy, especially when the boss will literally partially turn to stone and be untouchable. I've looked at the health numbers, and what's strange is this boss doesn't have the highest health of the full roster. Maybe there's something about splitting the damage between two enemies that lowers your actual damage output here, I'm not sure. But especially since the sponginess carries over into the second stage, something does just feel off, even after a few times. Augur isn't one of the most exciting fights, but again, I do really like the vibe of this fight a lot. The soundtrack, it really helps. In both appearance and with the music, Maris, Fathom of Night, flies through the air and creates an ocean as it goes by. It does also exhibit that annoying fly super far away all the time behavior that made Elden be such a drag, but each time it does, it'll do this beautiful spiral or flourish with a large splash of a wave that does make it really entrancing to watch. Maris is also the only boss in recent memory that inflicts sleep with some of its attacks. While not an immediate death, getting put to sleep heavily drains FP, which can be pretty rough on Revenant classes, specifically if they're relying on Lightning Spear, like me, or any character besides Iron Eye trying to use skills or spells for ranged attacks instead of melee. Speaking of Lightning Spear, I think a fully leveled Revenant with Lightning Spear and good scaling on that seal in question is honestly really hard to beat in terms of DPS against this boss. You can take massive chunks of health out with each spear, and Revenant can get a pretty beefy FP bar even though she has to use star shards to get that FP back. Maris will summon more jellyfish and tentacles to harass and distract you. The tentacles can be kind of difficult to avoid, especially if your focus is on the boss. I pretty regularly backed up right onto these only to get smacked in the ass. The tentacles can be destroyed, but I never found it to be worth it. By the time you destroy one, Maris will have spawned more. It's honestly best to just avoid these. The exploding jellyfish that spawn are actually a much more interesting mechanic, but it took me a while to figure out why. The jellyfish that spawn will swarm you and try to blow up. Initially, my tactic was just to run away, but if you kill these jellyfish, it'll actually chip away at the health of Maris. It does take some care, as taking time to stop and fight back leaves you open to other blasts from even more jellyfish, but it does have an active element to dealing with this attack. Phase 2 isn't super interesting besides the massive swarm of jellyfish. The only other attack of note is Maris's new bomb attack. This drop of water drops really slowly and can be destroyed before it touches down, but the whole descent inflicts sleep buildup and explodes on impact, sometimes causing a double whammy of HP and FP loss. If you're otherwise unable to destroy it, you could just run away though. Attacks like these sometimes require coordination where everyone needs to deal damage fast to prevent the droplet from blowing up. Even if you're spamming attacks, it might be too late before you realize your team just ran away while you weren't looking and now you're asleep next to a giant bomb. I go back and forth on what approach is more effective. I definitely don't choose to replay the Augur expedition as much as some of the others, but I do find it kind of enjoyable. Again, a large part of my enjoyment of these climactic fights is the aesthetic and vibe of the encounter, and Augur is, I think, a pretty neat addition and unique fight among the roster. So this fight has really grown on me. I wasn't initially looking forward to this fight after my first run against him back at launch. I realized on subsequent runs that my initial dislike mainly stemmed from me not understanding how boss weaknesses really worked in Nightreign. It's not just a boost to damage, though that does happen. Many bosses have attacks that can be countered really easily by using the right element. I didn't understand this because, if I'm remembering back to day 1, I think I went for this boss as soon as the full roster opened up after defeating Gladius. In that fight, I still don't know what the element weakness is actually doing. I see the glow appear, but that's about it. Going in to fight Fulgor without knowing about his lightning weakness, not that I even knew lightning was his weakness because holy shit this symbol is tiny, meant that I was getting smacked around by this real beefcake of a boss. Switching to using lightning weapons, especially a fast one like fist weapons or the veteran's prosthesis, absolutely tear this guy up, way faster than the greatswords I'd normally use when playing Wilder. When Fulgor charges up his Golden Lance AoE attack, he can be broken out of casting with enough lightning damage. His standard attacks are actually pretty fun to learn because tons of them have slight delays to the dodge timing. Long sweeps that drag along the ground whip out gravel at you, which are not only delayed but have way increased range. The way Mr. Centaur's aggro changes looks really fluid because of the way he spins around with these sweeping strikes. Phase 2 is where this boss feels like a combination of Yobu Onawa from Sekiro and Yudex Gundyr from Dark Souls 3. Fulgor's left arm bursts out into this long, goopy tentacle that slings shit at you with even longer sweeps than his lance. These swipes are harder to read, but are generally still delayed, with an added second attack of the goop as it flies out at you. I've read that this goop causes poison, but it's either not proccing on me, or that's been patched, or something's going on here. The large slam attacks can be jumped over instead of dodging, and the even larger AoE slams with the tentacle goop keep to that pattern. I love when some attacks can be dodged this way. It feels really funny to just do a little bunny hop over some wicked finishing move. This fight can be really fun. I almost feel bad when I'm with a full team with lightning equipment. I'd really like to learn the second phase a little better. I have a decent grasp on phase 1, but phase 2 is always where the juice is, and when I finish that too fast, I can't really learn it to master. Okay, so this is where we're going to get into my handful of favorite fights from their standard versions in Nightreign. These guys are in no particular order, but these next few bosses that we're going to talk about are all really fun for different reasons. The first of these is Libra, Creature of Night. This guy is honestly a joy to fight for me. The boss fight opens up with Goat Boy under a hood offering you a mysterious deal. You'll get a handful of choices from a decently long list that aren't super clear as to what they do, and most of them are going to have pretty big trade-offs. You can gain 3 levels, but lose 1 for every flask you drink. You can raise one of your stats at the cost of points in all the others. You can maybe gain a really powerful rare weapon in exchange for 2 whole character levels. Almost none of these are ever a good idea in the final boss room, as taking a 2 to 3 level hit is a big disadvantage during boss time. The one that could be good is I Wish for Eventual Greatness. This causes a 30% hit to health, FP, and stamina for the first 2 minutes of the boss fight, but after that, you get a 20% buff on top of your original level for those stats. If you're good about dodging or get kinda lucky, this can be a pretty big advantage. I've read these buffs go away if you get down, but I never take the deals from this guy. He can get fucked. The actual fight is a super fun variety mix. In addition to bonking you with his giant staff, Libra harnesses the power of madness to do all sorts of weird shit. He'll spawn AoEs directly at your feet that you just have enough time to dodge if you're careful. He can spawn fucking turrets in front of him that just pellet you with magic attacks. He can spawn raining little magic sprites that sprinkle down on top of you. All of Libra's non-physical attacks also cause madness buildup. Even if you're healing your way out of damage, the madness buildup will cause a loss of both FP and health, and additionally will leave you pretty vulnerable during that entire madness animation. To combat the madness buildup, Libra's non-physical attacks will leave these little gold bits on the ground. Running over these will alleviate madness buildup and can also give you a little bit of health back. Just don't get too distracted picking these up because he's probably right behind you and about to ruin your day. The most interesting thing Libra does is this meditation. He'll get in a little protective bubble and buff himself while sigils appear all around him. Running through or attacking these sigils causes Libra's little bubble to burst and he gets all pissy about it, slamming around and really just being whiny about the whole thing. His tantrum will leave him open for even more punishment when he dodges slams. Each time he meditates, more sigils will appear than what appeared before, and they'll also start appearing in the air. I hope there's an Iron Eye with you, or you get to deal with what comes after. Goatboy turns golden and gets way more aggressive with those magic attacks, which can quickly start to overlap and make entire sections of the arena completely off limits. This overlap of magic area denial attacks, as well as his weirdly timed melee combos, are just so fun to master. There's so much to keep track of, but because the AoEs have set patterns and the melee attacks, lunges, and slams are all pretty simple, it makes it really satisfying to track everything and know the direction of your dodges is so important because you might be dodging right into the line of one of those madness turrets. There's also the element of the vibe check. I've said before that the aesthetics of a boss fight are pretty important to me as a factor of my enjoyment, and Libra excels here. Madness and the Frenzied Flame is one of the cooler elements of Elden that, even after the DLC, I still think could get a little more time exploring. Libra provides a lot of that throughout his fight. Even though the attacks are madness-based, it's like he's used the Frenzied Flame as a power source for his own ends without succumbing to it. His boss description says he uses a dubious form of alchemy, suggesting the Frenzied Flame is for some scientific pursuit of power. Instead of just creating fireballs and erratic blasts like other enemies and incantations, Libra's attacks look like mathematical diagrams, symmetrical shapes, almost like a form of order, a real contender against the golden incantations of the Air Tree. I think a boss like this really should have been a part of Elden Ring or the DLC. It sucks that this game isn't exactly canon to the original because Libra could have been a really cool addition to the score. The best enhancer to this fight is without a doubt the music. For all the science and order and math that seem to be a part of Libra, he's still a monster, a creature of the night. Even his title implies that he's some kind of abomination. The boss music is probably the single most frantic track I've ever heard in a Souls game. It's so loud and in your face. The drums pound forward as the Beast of Madness lunges at you in his fit of rage. Dissonant horns blast in your ears as Libra summons enormous pools of the very essence of madness. It's just so good. Soulsborne soundtracks are some of my favorite in the industry, and Libra's is definitely up there in terms of my favorite tracks overall. I genuinely have so much fun every time I fight this weird freak. Libra is one of the only bosses I've chosen to beat solo, and it was even sort of by accident while doing Wilder's Remembrance quest. Every time I fight him is just so reactive. I always feel like I'm on the back foot looking for ways to retaliate, and with the way Libra lays traps for you, it doesn't just feel like dodge, stab, dodge, stab. It feels like you're outsmarting him. By dodging with more care to avoid his own strategy, it's even more satisfying to bring the hurt. Libra really is one of the better fights From Software have made. I love the DLC boss battle in Midra's Manse, and I think the Equilibrus Beast fight would really fit nicely alongside that one. I don't know just how FromSoft managed to figure out the perfect formula for dragon fights almost from day one. I also don't know how they've managed to iterate and improve so much on that dragon fight format. The dragon fights consistently rank really highly in my overall feelings about favorite boss fights throughout the series. I don't think Caligo is my favorite, but damn if this fight didn't wow me the first time I got in there. I think that's what a lot of these bosses were lacking up until this point, that wow factor. The way I felt when I climbed up to the top of Bale's Mountain in Shadow of the Erdtree. That build to a climax that just blows you away before smacking you immediately while you're dumbstruck. Now, Caligo is by no means as unforgiving as Bale was, or even other climactic dragon fights of the series, but when you enter the field and see wings rising out of the fog unmoving, it feels like seeing the everlasting dragons from the first Dark Souls game's intro cutscene. It is a bit disappointing that the arena is mostly the same as the other bosses. This dragon really feels like the master of this domain, more so than the way other bosses feel like the master of theirs. We're trespassing, and Caligo is not happy. Phase 1 of Caligo's fight is mostly dodging wide sweeps and cones of frost breath, and tail swipes. Her head is a good way to break stance, and she does tend to keep it low, especially on her long breath attacks. The main thing you'll be fighting is that Caligo loves flying away after you get a few hits in. Once Caligo lands again after leaping away, you can pretty reliably expect another breath attack. Her tail swipes also include these wound-up overhead tail slams. It feels like Caligo thinks of you more as a nuisance than an opponent, just a bug to be squashed. As Phase 1 goes on, Caligo sometimes flies away and that mysterious fog closes in. The music gets real quiet and the sounds of battle fade to a cold winter silence, like if you ever stood on your porch in the winter after a fresh snow. That silence is broken by the sounds of ice cracking all around you. You'll look up and find the sky itself is forming into an ice field, and the radius is spreading out from Caligo at the epicenter. When the ice reaches a frankly absurd distance, that ice dome shatters and shards of glass branches rain down and eviscerate you if you're not out of the way. All of Caligo's attacks can pack a wallop and most of them will build up frost, but what really carries the fight up to this point is the music. This feels like a really unique track in the Souls catalog. It's almost the polar opposite to Libra's fight. Where the Beast of Madness is frantic and driving, Caligo's track flows gracefully from piano to building strings, the choir almost fading into the background like a chill wind in the night. Phase 2 causes Caligo to be consumed by a giant wind, howling into the night and joining the choir. She spreads her wings in a fury, actually choosing to use her full power of ice and wind to stop you. You finally got her attention. The choir swells to be more than just the wind. The voices become those that would sing for the gods themselves. In Phase 2, Caligo will soar into the air and dive bomb the Nightfarers with a rain of ice meteors. They aren't too hard to dodge, but if you don't, they'll knock you down over and over again. Caligo will also shroud herself in fog like in Phase 1, this time summoning all the winds and mists of the night to blast out at you. You can use the nearby icebergs for cover or get behind her if you're quick, but if you don't, this wave of fog is really tricky to dodge. The spikes of ice littering the ground now explode and cause even more frostbite buildup. Caligo's scale really wowed me here. There's few actual dragons that you fight besides those ancient ones. Fighting Caligo felt different from others of her kind. She really feels primeval like the everlasting dragons. She feels less like a monster and more of a force of nature. Once the second phase begins, a cosmically massive eye can be seen in the distance. The Fissure of the Fog description tells of a great shadowy pair of eyes framed in a frigid mist, appearing at history's greatest junctures. It's as though the dragon you've been fighting isn't even really the full miasma of the night. That's something far greater is lurking behind the veil, watching your every move. And with the attention of this god from another realm comes a lot more power to fight against. Like with the Frenzied Flame, frost magic and its connection to the moon and the cosmos were something I really liked about the aesthetic of certain magics in Elden Ring, and it's a joy to get that whole vibe distilled into an entire dragon for one boss encounter. That aesthetic I love so much makes up a lot for what's kind of a boring fight though. If your limveld has the mountaintop shifting earth, this fight can be really trivialized as you'll negate a lot of that frost buildup and do even more damage with it present. Bringing the Fire Giant's Whip is also just crazy broken. It's definitely more situational as a legendary drop goes, but man does this thing melt the dragon. though I don't mind it being overpowered because it looks really cool to use, like it was practically built for this. I feel like Caligo is one of the easier fights overall, but it's such a great climax to an expedition. The flow of the fight is way more important to me here than the straight challenge, and it's one that I come back to pretty often. I don't think Caligo is going to win out over my other favorite dragon fights like Bale and Midir, but I still love capping off a run with this fight. Plus, the soundtrack is the only one from this game that made it into my own music library. It just really is that good. Night Aspect is the final boss fight of this game if you don't look down at the section titles in the chapter screen. Just please pretend with me for a little while. You can face the Night Aspect if you've defeated 4 different Night bosses, but I waited until I beat all the rest before this big finale. The Night Aspect can be seen on the horizon of the battlefield, slowly dragging a sword behind wary feet, pierced by multiple different weapons. He's barely aggressive as you approach, evoking memories of Vendrick from Dark Souls 2, a warrior having faced endless battles. Provoking him barely draws his attention. All he has for you is his sword. His attacks come slowly and deliberately at first. His swings and spins are relatively easy to dodge. The Night Aspect weaves between each Nightfarer with an ease and grace not really seen with other of these duel fights. After enough damage, Hellstor draws more weapons out of his own wounded body and fights more and more fiercely. Holy Damage has the ability to break down his defense and attack power, giving you a very slight edge. Draining this health bar fells the Night Lord. Great, easy. His body oozes with the dark essence of night itself. The world fades to black and you reappear standing off with this new avatar of the night. His sword now glowing bright against the deep night sky and his posture straighter. The sword swings now are imbued with magic. He'll slam down into the ground, blasting away. Hellstor's roar into the night draw the very essence of night to follow you. With his faster sweeping swings and unleashed strength, Hellstor can leap from great distances to change foes and come straight for you. I found myself dodging every attack whether or not I'm the target just so that I can keep time with the rhythm of those attacks. I never knew when Hellstor's attention would shift to me mid-combo. These sets of attacks are smooth and flowing, but the changing attention adds a really erratic pace to the fight. They reminded me a lot of the early phases of Slave Knight Gale from Dark Souls 3. At around 60% health, Hellstor flies into the air and with his glowing sword cuts a rift into the very fabric of reality to another place and time. From this other place, he draws the power of one of the other subjugated Night Lords, imbuing his own attacks with a random status effect and creating rifts in the ground with each swing. These rifts can stack damage along with the sword swing and can build up various status effects depending on which Night Lord Hellstor is drawing his power from. These extra damage rifts are super fun to track and dodge. They remind me, again, of the later phases of Slave Knight Gale. The Night Rift attacks end with a giant series of slashes that create even bigger rifts and explosions in the ground, with a final absolutely huge AoE attack that can drain the health bar of almost any Nightfarer if you haven't been taking health boost perks as rewards. After the end of the Rift phase, Hellstor is going to switch back to his normal Phase 2 attacks, but at any point he can summon another Rift later and do the whole nuke combo all over again. The dodge timings for these attacks is more delayed than it would otherwise appear and does take some learning. I fought the Night Aspect a lot of times trying to defeat him with each Nightfarer, so I got lots of practice learning these timings. I think of all the bosses, even the Everdark ones, Hellstor might be the most replayable, at least in my opinion. Finally defeating this Avatar of Night grants you the primordial rune of the Night Lord and you're transported to this even more decrepit and separated round table hold. Here you can offer the rune to a desiccated corpse, seemingly of a random servant found throughout the lands between. As the Nightfarer walks out of the hold into the night, they're transformed into the very light of grace. Other wisps of light find each other and leave the hold altogether, flying off into the breaking light of dawn. This final confrontation with the Night Lord is a perfect climax to the base game story. The fight remains fresh and different each time, unlike some of the other night bosses, and every Nightfarer can have a great time with this fight. Each has the ability to build up gear and stats to have a really strong impact during this duel. You might think that's where the story ends, that defeating the Night Lord is all there is. Thankfully, not long into the life of this game, FromSoft gave hints of the night gathering even after we thought it defeated, gathering into even stronger forms that test the very limits of player skill and definitely testing my patience. Let's talk about the biggest pre-DLC additions to Nightreign, Everdark Sovereigns and the Deep of Night challenge mode.
The big finale. I hardly want it to end.
Isn't that always the way?
Everdark bosses are, put quite simply, phase 2 and 3 of every single boss besides Hellstore. They were released slowly over the summer weeks, with 2 at a time being available to play for any given week. I do think this is a little annoying, since I'd love to play all of the Everdark bosses whenever I want, because this made gathering footage super annoying. I wouldn't know when the next time would come that I'd get footage, and I got married while writing this script, so I just lost weeks of time to this problem, and I had to wait even longer to write this section. But I also get it. I really do. The existing boss roster already heavily splits the player base, and adding 2 new bosses splits things even further. Wow, I wonder if crossplay might have helped with that little problem. But ultimately, it's a solution to a problem that From Software hasn't really had to tackle before, so I'll let it slide this time. But enough about all that. Let's explore what each new form of the boss brings to the table. The good, the bad, and the fucking terrible. Gladius was the last boss to get an Everdark release, but it's going to be the first I'm putting here on my list. This boss is a really great example of what an Everdark Sovereign fight should be. New moves and dodge timings to learn, some hidden mechanics that surprise and can quickly overwhelm, and an increased spectacle to make dying over and over a little bit prettier to look at. Gladius starts in phase 2 of the standard fight, immediately splitting into its triple gank phase. This is pretty much all the standard attacks of your regular phase 2. The difficulty comes from having almost no warm-up phase. The phase 2 of the Everdark fight brings a massive sweeping of fire change attacks that do absolutely crazy damage. The big fire aura also makes the damage zone slightly harder to predict and dodge through. These sweep attacks regularly took out half of my health bar even after multiple max health upgrades. Gladius will occasionally walk slowly with the sword held in its mouth, and for some reason attacking him at this stage causes him to gain attack power and a buff that can stack multiple times. Even if you know not to target him, your teammates might not, or spells that were activated from far away might hit now after he chooses this stance. I think this move is what frustrates more than the increased damage itself. This idea that you have to halt all momentum in the fight and just wait around, sometimes for what feels like a pretty long while just to start getting your attacks going again. My favorite attack is the nuke combo, where Gladius swipes the chains around and causes fire fissures in the ground before they explode, just like that elemental nuke from the Night aspect. It really adds to a shared identity, like this dog really is a part of the Night, is influenced by Hellstore, like the bond shared between Sif and Artorias. It's just a fun nod, and honestly here I think it looks absolutely sick. This boss took me longer to finally take down than I'd like to admit, and I think it might actually have taken me until its second appearance as an option before I finally saw victory. This boss really necessitates the use of holy damage just to gain any kind of edge, because damage-wise, this fight feels like the most punishing of the Everdark lot. This is a really interesting fight because it's an Everdark fight with an additional phase 3. Although, phase 3 is admittedly not super interesting. He just splits back into 3 dogs again, but in the more aggressive version. The sword-wielding dog is the biggest one to be worried about, as it can perform some of the phase 2 attacks while you're also getting fucking chomped by the other 2. It feels like a pretty natural progression given the increased difficulty of the fight. Okay, so here's the really funny thing about this boss. I'm writing this section on Gaping Jaw after grinding out Deep of Night runs and getting really annoyed about it, which we'll definitely get to later. I was dreading facing this guy again because the original Gaping Jaw really rubbed me the wrong way. And don't get me wrong, some of this fight is still a little bit shit. But honestly, I think it's starting to grow on me. The vibes do carry pretty hard here, but that's so much of my Souls experience anyway that I can forgive a little bullshit, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. Like all Everdark bosses, he starts out basically in phase 2 of the regular fight. He doesn't have too many more moves than the standard, but this time he'll use more lightning attacks and, at least in my experience, more long-range lunges and grab attacks. Sometimes those grab attacks come one after the other. The biggest change to this fight rhythm is when he enters this new phase 2. He throws this big tantrum, curls up into a weird ball, and teleports all over the arena before disappearing. A purple beam from the sky will tell you where you need to look for, and you do not want to be near this. You need to run away as far as you can because this pissed off boy is coming back with a whole ass tornado. Once it forms, you can use Spirit Springs to launch over the tornado and into the now more enclosed arena. This is both super cool and a bit annoying. The tornado does a ton of damage, and it can be hard to tell where it's actually going to form. Even if you're outside the tornado, if you wait too long to jump in the Spirit Spring, you're going to start taking chip damage. So, I guess it's a tough call to make. This can make reviving tough because Adele can knock you out of that safe zone. Even if a ranged attack gets you up, you'll be inside the realm of the tornado and immediately start chipping away at your health again. But even with my small complaints, this is actually a really fun fight. It somehow felt less frustrating than the original, even though its biggest attack change is sorta hard to deal with. I put this sort of in the middle of my experience with the Everdark bosses. The Everdark Sentient Pest might be the most drawn-out fight in the entire game, except maybe the Everdark Libra, and we'll get there and talk a little bit about why. I lean toward this being longer because there's ways to manage the length of Libra, but not so much here. We begin with the two creepy crawlies already joined in messing up your day. Lots of AoE attacks, lots of charges, you remember, fun stuff. Phase 2 is wild. A third, sort of translucent bug appears and starts flying around the map. Once one of the bugs dies, this third bug enters the body of the corpse and revives it, spending its own health in the process. The reawakened corpse now goes back to its phase 1 attack set, but with all of these moves enhanced and modified due to this possession. They have longer range and do way more damage. The Moth's Sky Barrage is especially hard to predict and can melt you if you're anywhere near it. The unpossessed monster will behave normally. As you wear down the health of each of the original two bugs, the new enemy will again spend its health and revive the fallen comrade. The only way to end this fight is to get that new bug to die so that it can't revive the other two anymore. You'd think to just prioritize the new guy, but that's not so simple. The two OGs are still especially dangerous, and the translucent nature of the third one makes locking on really hard, so ranged attacks have to be aimed manually, which is a super bad idea, and the new bug rarely, if ever, gets low enough for any considerable melee damage. Overall, my feelings about this one aren't great, it's just more. More damage, more running around, more time spent on a boss that was already kind of meh to me. I don't expect the Everdark bosses, or any Night Lord for that matter, to be weak and just a cakewalk, but given the low health flask supply, this is one hell of an endurance fight, and there's no way to outmaneuver that. I don't really like coming back to this one if I'm being honest with myself. Other than the vibes, the standard Augur boss just didn't really wow me. It felt a little bit boring with the way it moves around the map, in addition to just so many jellyfish. It's either chasing down the boss constantly, or completely melting the boss with Lightning Spear. Suffice it to say, I was not excited for this Everdark fight. It ends up being fine? It's not exactly that much more difficult. I mean, it has a bigger health bar, but the same weaknesses apply in Phase 1. Phase 2 was actually a massive disappointment for me on several levels. See, my favorite Dark Souls game, I think, has evened out to being 3. It's the closest in design to Bloodborne, and I've just played it a lot more than the others. I love almost the entire boss roster, and the DLC is full of the best fights of the series. One thing I do in almost every playthrough is the quest for Seaguard of Katarina. I love the big goofy Onion Knight and his backstory being long-lost friends with Yorm the Giant. It's something I just find really compelling in this game. So when I get to Phase 2 of Augur and I see that my weapons in my inventory now have the Storm Ruler ability, I go from, wait, what? To, wait, what? To, oh no, in really short order. The Yorm fight gets away with it specifically because of the lore, the arena, the NPCs, and the soundtrack. They all make up for what's essentially a gimmick fight. It's not perfect as is, but I still like it a lot. Augur has none of that. What you're left with is frustrating, equalizing mechanic that makes everyone sprint around to get close enough for the weapon art to work, but not too close that the even bigger attacks of Phase 2 don't clean your clock. I'd have been thrilled to see the Storm Ruler Greatsword make it into the rest of the game, and that weapon art would have been fun if certain enemies had a weakness to it. But to put it in here, when I've come to expect a lot more from these bosses, is honestly just a real letdown. When FromSoft announced the Sovereign Libra was next on the docket, I was so hyped. Oh my god, yes, I can't wait. This was my second favorite boss fight, getting a whole new and exciting phase that was sure to be even crazier than the first time around, right? Well, no, actually. Fuck you if you thought that was coming. Instead, we've got something even better. NPC fights that mirror the characters that you guys brought. Now, each of the Nightfarer clones have set equipment they bring in, which is a very small mercy, so they won't be coming at you with just legendary weapons or anything. So this basically turns into a 9-way shitfest. Now, some of the people like that sort of masochism. I'm not sure I do. My initial thoughts were that of that Gankfest in the Sunken King DLC of Dark Souls 2. Did anyone have fun with that? Not me, not this guy, but the Gankfest isn't all you're signed up for. Libra is still going to spam random debuffs during the party with such a small indicator of what's going on that you're likely to fall prey to either the debuffs or like 3 smackdowns at once. One of those debuffs lowers your level anytime you heal. God forbid you want to heal. Another makes your allies invisible. Better look out for the wisp indicators when they go down or you'll have no idea where to go. Goat White also will just wall off parts of the arena. They took everything I loved about the Libra fight and swapped it for the types of mechanics I despise when they pop up in the series. This one is unfortunately a 2 thumbs down from me. I didn't even get to really enjoy it until I came back with the Scholar, so we'll get there to maybe a little bit of positive, but man, this was so disappointing. The souped up version of Dark Drift Knight didn't blow me away, but it also isn't nearly as bad as Libra. This is another case of more, rather than having a big twist on the fight. Partway through, the Dark Drift Knight prays and gets the power of God and anime and is reinvigorated with holy power. His nuke arrow in this phase is parryable by the Executor, like with Hellstore's nuke, which is cool. His sweeping combos are fun and flowy to dodge, and he keeps his long sweeps. It's really pretty good. This is probably the one I've fought the least, besides the really bad fights. He's just not usually on the list of playable enemies when I'm online, and it can be weeks between appearances. Overall, I really like this Phase 2 a lot more than Phase 1. He cuts off that poison arm, so it's at least a little clearer where his combos are going. And while some of those combos are really sweeping and aggressive, they're actually a lot easier to dodge than they initially look. His dual blade combos mostly have a left-right rhythm to them, making positioning key to knowing when to dodge. If you mistime the first dodge of the combo, like thinking he's starting right, but you're not positioned right, you're going to get smacked on his follow-up attack. But if you happen to be at the right angle to the sweep, it might just go over your head. It's not the most sophisticated thing to learn, but it always looks super badass when you're dodging and ducking underneath these massive sweeps with a holy blade. His nuke also has a fairly limited AoE range compared to other nukes by other bosses, so escape is super possible. He'll typically target one of the 3 players with his Death Ray Holy Arrow, and even if you're the one that's targeted, running away is still possible. Both forms of Fulgor also really take advantage of knowing when jumping over an AoE attack is actually the safer option than dodging or blocking. Considering my incessant use of Wilder's Grapple, this also makes for some super sick looking moves. All in all, it's pretty good, but that's largely because I feel like this Everdark fight is one of the smaller departures from its base version, which is also still pretty good. Everdark Caligo is, to me, neither better or worse than its standard version. It's just more of what's good about the original. The thing is, I really like the original Phase 1 and 2. I think the transition into Phase 2 with Caligo screaming into the night is just so captivating. I really do think Caligo is basically a perfect dragon boss. I don't see anything wrong with it. Caligo here gets a few new ice AoE attacks. The most dangerous one, the Ice Pillar Explosion, takes a long time to charge up and for Caligo to execute, giving you a big opportunity to stagger her out of this attack. Otherwise, get ready for some frostbite. The soundtrack takes my favorite of the OGs and gives it what feels a lot like a typical Dark Souls vibe, with more soaring vocals and crashing cymbals, with a final transition to soft and somber piano, as if all the power Caligo is using to destroy you is somehow diminishing the night and the cold winds with it. The brief violin interludes give a brief respite to the fight, while both forces gather strength for a final push, winner take all. Again, I have to gas up how amazing this developer is at making these massive dragons seem imposing and almost unbeatable, but giving you just enough hope that you can make it through. These are surmountable gods, and victory always feels so sweet. And that's all of the Everdark fights at its time of writing. Not counting DLC, that's gonna wrap up boss talk. Thank fucking God. To cap off content from the base game, I want to briefly talk and largely complain about the other major content update for Nightreign before the DLC, the Deep of Night mode. Deep of Night is the second major content addition after the Everdark Sovereign bosses. It's essentially just a hard mode. Enemies tend to have more health and also maybe do more damage. Sometimes enemies will have a red aura around them, which means they're empowered by the night or something and are basically damage sponges. Oh, and bosses can have this aura too, so sometimes you'll come across the bell-bearing hunter who's been juicing up while you were busy. Good luck with that! With the red enemies come chances to spawn unique versions of weapons that have additional perks, usually pretty strong ones, but these weapons also seem to have some kind of curse in the form of an additional perk that'll be a drawback in some way. In true Nightreign fashion, some of these detriments are not immediately clear in what they're doing to you. You'll also get access to 3 more slots for perk stones for each character. These 3 slots can only be filled with stones earned via Deep of Night and only activate when playing that mode. These stones, like the cursed weapons, also usually contain drawbacks that you'll have to deal with. You don't get to pick the boss in Deep of Night. You have to make a well-rounded build or hope for the best if you specialized at all. You do the Night's Raid, earn some points, and after you get enough points, you'll go down deeper into the night. The deeper you go, the tougher enemies get. Going even deeper can cause the map to lose all point of interest indicators, so you'll have to use your memory and eyeballs to seek out the bosses and loot. This one is kind of annoying. I don't know, this addition adds difficulty in the form of inconvenience rather than just challenge. Since there's no visual indicator outside of the map to tell you which POIs contain loot for certain affinity types, you're gonna have to guess and hope you make the right call. Better hope you come across some of those health flask chapels too. At deeper levels, Everdark bosses can also spawn as the final battle. Since you can't pick the boss at the start, the difference can really be crazy here. I haven't had the poor luck to face Everdark Libra at any depth here in my time, but boy howdy does that sound like a terrible time or what. Worst of all is the confusing nature of progression in this mode. The deeper your level, up to the max of 5, the points you lose for being defeated goes up, but the points you earn for victory remain largely the same. There's a base score of 200 points for victory, but joining a match at a lower level can earn you fewer points. Losing a match at level 3 and above loses you even more points than multiple victorious runs. The numbers here are just really wild, and they really require perfect play across dozens of runs to max out that level. I couldn't be bothered to get that far, I admit. There's just no incentive besides love of the game to get that far. There's no trophies or special skins or relics, just bragging rights, which to me isn't worth the dozens of failed runs and teammates leaving early when they get all pissy about dying to the Night 1 boss or something. If it sounds like I'm kinda sour on this game mode, it's because I am. I think even the worst of the Everdark bosses are at least kind of interesting. The challenge they add is not just of inconvenience, and you can always try to build towards something that'll be really effective. Deep of Night adds difficulty only in the form of RNG. There's no new actual content to be had here, just some new perks to tack onto existing loot, which at this point in my playtime has already really worn down its welcome. To add to this growing list of gripes, a smaller minority of the player base even plays this mode, so matchmaking queue times go way up, especially if you're playing in off-peak hours, even more so than the weekly rotation of Everdark bosses. Speaking of those, a really funny thing happened to me while writing this section. After several sort of frustrating hours of Deep of Night runs, I went back to Everdark bosses that originally kind of annoyed me, like Gaping Jaw and even Gladius. Coming back to these fights actually ended up being really fun, and I had to rewrite my opinions on those bosses after having a pretty good time outside of Deep of Night. Even the loop drops outside of this mode feel more satisfying, which suggests to me that the Deep of Night loot pool is tuned kind of poorly. Now that could be just my experience, but hey, we're already almost 2 hours into this mess. I don't need to keep saying "in my opinion" after everything at this point, do I? I get the feeling that this mode is really best enjoyed by the kind of player that is so good at these games that the standard difficulty has reached the level of boring. The players with 1,000-hour max level characters in Elden Ring and can only really feel something if they beat the game at rune level 1 blindfolded while using a DDR pad for controls. And no shade at all to those players, I've seen some really impressive challenge runs and mods come out of this community, but look, that just ain't my life. I honestly don't think I'm ever going to come back to this mode unless the game somehow retools the loot pool and maybe adds a lot more DLC weapons. It's just that every run, no matter what Deep of Night level you're on, just feels like such a slog. It's not satisfying to fight these enemies, and there's never really any satisfying reward at the end. Add to that I've had more players leave my party during these runs than any other in the series, and it just kind of sucks the fun out of everything I like about the series. And yeah, that's where most of this video was supposed to be wrapped up. I was going to go into some minor concluding criticisms and remarks, looking at the game's uncertain future without word about the DLC, and I was hoping to have this game out for the Thanksgiving holiday. And then...
Brute force alone will not lead to victory. All things possess an inherent logic. If you face an impasse, try looking at things afresh.
So yeah, about 2 weeks before release, FromSoft dropped a trailer about the upcoming DLC, The Forsaken Hollows. It would add 2 new characters, 2 new final bosses, a whole new Shifting Earth, and a handful of other Night 1 and Night 2 bosses. Let's dig into this too by going into the 2 new characters, the Undertaker and the Scholar, both of whom absolutely excel in a group environment. The Undertaker might be my new favorite character to play as, full stop. Her main weapon of choice is a hammer, and her unique moveset is really good with both horizontal and overhead swipes. Her S scaling and strength and faith mean that these hammers also do obscene damage. This massive damage output makes her pretty valuable even for solo play. Her character skill, Trance, reduces stamina consumption, changes the dodge roll to a quick step, and increases combo damage. It can also increase the damage for her ult, Loathsome Hex. This ultimate ability makes the Undertaker zip around super fast to the nearest enemy or whichever one you have targeted and smashes into them full throttle with a giant spiked bone. This ability is great for damage and staggering, but also amazing for traversal. The damage output can revive allies, and you're able to even close that distance really fast. The Undertaker's passive ability is what makes her one of my favorites to play in a group. Confluence means that anytime another character uses their ultimate ability, the Undertaker gets a free use of her own. Even if you just use that ultimate, you can immediately follow up with another. I've played in squads where all 3 of us were Undertaker, and this can cause some of the highest DPS against the field bosses I've seen in this game, period. The one major drawback of the Confluence ability is that it does rely on your teammates to use their ultimates. In my experience, characters like Duchess and Guardian typically wait until teammates are down before activating their abilities in order to perform that revive, whereas Wilder and Iron Eye often use their abilities as much as possible. The Undertaker is best utilized when characters are using their ultimate abilities as often as they're possible. I feel like the Undertaker was kind of born out of a meme. In forums online, it'd always get a laugh to post a picture of the Revenant holding a giant colossal weapon due to her short size. This might also be a common trope because of the typical pairing of faith and strength, but Revenant was never really the perfect character to use colossal weapons, though it is pretty funny. So the Undertaker for me is almost a response to that. Someone with relatively small stature, but somehow one of the hardest hitting characters with strength-based weapons like colossal swords and hammers, and the addition of an A rank in faith. This is definitely just pure conjecture on my part, but it's one of those things I find really entertaining about playing this character over and over. The Scholar is probably the most unique Nightfarer mechanically. He is a true support and definitely takes some time getting used to. He has pretty average health, stamina, and FP, but his only S rank stat is Arcane. Everything else is C or D. You'd think intelligence would be higher given his background, but no, he's not for casting most types of spells. His entire role is based around analyzing enemies, stacking buffs and debuffs, and applying extra status effects. At high levels, Scholar can proc any kind of status effect in 2 or 3 hits. My initial runs with the character use a poison sword with the Seppuku skill. This meant I could activate poison and bleed at almost the same time. Even though you'd look at the raw damage numbers for the sword and be disappointed, the status effects you bring with you more than make up for it. Additionally, during this run, I found the Ripple Blade, which is an axe that scales exclusively with the Arcane stat. The Scholar absolutely mashes enemies when you're using this weapon. Combined with one of the rot-based thrusting swords, I was honestly shocked at the damage I was able to put out for a character that has really mediocre strength and dexterity. This makes him an interesting complement to the Executor, whose high Arcane stat also encourages a status-based build. The Scholar is even more so at the cost of raw damage output. His passive ability, Bagcraft, gives him bigger pockets to store items, and using items repeatedly can level them up and make them more powerful. Scholar should really be spamming these items to get them as high a level as possible. Bringing a relic that confers items' effects to nearby allies causes that increased potency to go to your allies as well. His skill, Analyze, allows him to gain advantages over enemies the longer he stares at them. Scholar remains vulnerable during this analysis, which goes slower the farther away you are. Completing your analysis of the enemies grants either a debuff to the enemy or a buff to your allies, who can also be analyzed for even more buffs. This ability can also be used over and over again on the same enemies to keep re-upping that status debuff. I found this ability to be indispensable when fighting the Everdark Libra due to all the NPCs that spawn around the map. His ultimate ability, Communion, connects all nearby enemies together, and separately connects all nearby allies. Any damage you inflict on a threaded enemy is also inflicted on any connected ones. Any buff or healing flask a Nightfarer uses also applies itself to those connected allies, which can wildly increase healing potential and item bonuses from the Scholar's leveled up bag of goodies. It's just really cool when it works. This is another ability that can really turn the tide against groups like the Misbegotten Everjail fights and the Everdark Libra NPC spawns. The NPCs that spawn have honestly a lot of health even when you're fighting at level 15, but when you use Communion, you can stack that damage and take out the group as a whole to prevent your team from getting overwhelmed. He's best played by zooming in, proccing a status effect, then backing off and analyzing the combat field, all while spamming items where possible. This character feels the strangest because this is the first truly support-driven character I've ever seen in a game like this. It's a type of playstyle that really only works with group play. Trying to play Scholar solo, for me, is akin to pulling teeth. He's just not built to take on the world by himself. In a group, however, I had an absolute blast. While playing this game, I kind of realized that this is a similar playstyle to running support in Battlefield, which is what I'm usually playing when I'm not using the Engineer class. While I'm okay at Souls games, I'm still not perfect at combat, and being able to take a more supportive role to help more skilled allies is a really great addition to have in a game like this. I was genuinely shocked at how much fun I was having. When this character was shown off and designated as a support class, I was worried I'd never want to use him. But actually playing as this character, I'm having almost as much fun as when I tried the Undertaker for the first time. His abilities are a lot more intuitive to use than I used to think, and his damage output is a lot higher than you'd initially expect from his stats. This character adds a ton of variety, and I always welcome a skilled Scholar on my team if I'm not choosing that character myself. The Great Hollow is one of the biggest map departures I've seen from a From Software DLC release. I haven't done the math, but I think based on playable square footage, this area might even rival some DLCs from previous titles. Again, that's just playable, walkable areas, doesn't count skyboxes. This shifting earth encompasses the entirety of the map, creating a whole new world. I'm not even entirely sure the term shifting earth is appropriate here. This really is just a whole new map with all new mechanics that isn't limited to just a quarter or a third of the playable map as with other shifting earth encounters. The name The Great Hollow initially to me implied a connection to the Great Hollow from Dark Souls 1, and maybe there could be some tenuous connections like how there's really large tree branches in certain places, but this entire area really feels closer to when you initially discover Siofra River in Elden Ring. Where Limveld felt very evenly spaced out, the Great Hollow feels like it functions more in concentric circles and stacked layers of play. There's the main crystal in the center, fields and mini-bosses and resonant crystals surrounding that area, and castle structures higher up in the outermost ring. This creates an entirely new flow to completing the level, which requires a lot more vertical travel due to the lack of spectral hawks placed as frequently as in Limveld. The crystal mechanic of this level is still one that frustrates me even after multiple runs. Entering any of those outer castles without destroying the crystal in the middle causes your health to halve for the entire time you spend indoors. You have to find multiple resonant crystals around the map and interact with them in order to break the crystal in the center and lift the curse. The reward for destroying the center crystal also doesn't feel super strong compared to other shifting earths. All it does is make your ultimate attacks recharge faster when you're already out of sacred flasks. This means that if you complete a final boss without using all of your flasks, you haven't actually benefited from this reward at all. The locations of these resonant crystals aren't viewable on the map until the start of day 2, so if you want to explore any of the indoor spaces on day 1, you either have to know the map extremely well or just plan to suffer a lower health bar from the curse. 4 crystals needs to be broken for the center crystal to shatter. Some of these locations are obvious and recurrent. Others are pretty well hidden and not immediately visible unless you deliberately search them out. Sometimes the crystals are near bosses, sometimes they aren't. This can lead to a lot of wasted time looking for crystals just for the chance to explore some of these castle dungeons, but you spend so much time looking for crystals that often your exploration is cut short unless you're willing to deal with the curse. I like a lot of these dungeons, but this feels like a lose-lose situation to me given the short time of each run. There's new night boss field encounters added here too, which are also kind of bad. The one I've encountered the most is the Gladius encounter. This causes the 3 dogs from that fight to spawn at different parts of the map. They emit energy into the world that causes your health bar to consistently drain from fire damage. Their general locations are marked on the map, and you have to go seek them out and kill them one by one to lift this status effect. However, they're all placed so far around the map that just getting to them usually takes forever, and every single time I have to deal with this encounter, the Nightreign was already closing in, causing me to have to fight one of the dogs while taking additional damage from the storm. Each time you kill one of the dogs, the damage from the fire effect grows. This means that if you've left the final dog for a location in the storm, you're going to be taking massive chip damage just from the overall effects, not even counting having to deal with the dog's attacks, which are still pretty strong. The one bright side here is that the dogs individually don't have a lot of health, so they're pretty easy to deal with if you actually get there in time. The more large dogs you kill, the more smaller dogs spawn around you that harass you until you either complete the encounter or night closes in. I initially thought these smaller dogs would be more annoying, but they're actually very easy to avoid, so just don't bother fighting them. They all disappear once the 3 main dogs are destroyed anyway. The reward gives you some stamina recovery and bonus combo damage. I really feel like this one isn't super worth completing if you can deal with the honestly minor chip damage until the end of the night. It takes so much time to get to each dog that you're honestly better off fighting field bosses in the meantime. Once the storm goes past the dogs for a certain amount of time, they just disappear. That means if they disappear before you've killed all 3, but you've already started the hunt, you've wasted your time and you get no reward. One way the Great Hollow really shines is in its architecture and enemy variety, which both take a lot of inspiration from Shadow of the Erdtree. Cursed Blades, Divine Beast Warriors, and Inquisitors all appear as field bosses in some of these shattered temples. I was so happy to see any amount of Shadow of the Erdtree content make its way into this DLC that I almost completely missed that no single weapons from the DLC have been added to this loot pool. It's exactly the same loot pool as in Limveld. This confusing 1-2 punch is simultaneously the best thing and the most disappointing thing about the Great Hollow and the expansion as a whole. The developers have left so much on the table by not including any weapons in the DLC. I have been absolutely frothing at more chances to use the unique weapons that were added in Shadow of the Erdtree, especially the light greatswords. So many things in that expansion were so cool, but my only ability to use them is either a super hard DLC that I'm not really keen on playing again, or bringing them into the base game on a New Game Plus run, which I've already put hundreds and hundreds of hours into. A roguelike game thrives on increasing the ability for players to craft builds and add more variety to their potential loot pool. I may find more hammers now that I'm playing Undertaker a lot, but they're mostly just the Fire Prelate Monk hammers that I've already seen time and time again throughout the game, and they don't add a whole lot to my experience. Where this expansion makes up a little bit of that disappointment is in the boss encounters that it adds for Night 1 and 2. These new Night 1 and Night 2 bosses, except for one, are all either from previous Dark Souls games or Shadow of the Erdtree. They really only appear if you're fighting the Balancers or the Dreglord, but I'm just really happy to see all of these additions, especially the Demon in Pain and the Demon from Below. This was one of my favorite bosses from the Ring City and Dark Souls 3 as a whole. In that game, you have to fight 2 gigantic demons at once, where one mainly does fire damage and the other mainly does poison damage. Once you kill them both, they combine into the Demon Prince for Phase 3, with a slightly modified moveset depending on which demon you defeated first when they were both alive. The Demon Prince fight in Dark Souls 3 became one of my favorite fights against any kind of demonic entity in the series. Here in Nightreign, while they're still both aggressive and the boss arena is much smaller for the double demon fight, it's a lot more forgiving. It's forgiving because you only have to defeat the pair to end the fight for the night. Once the pair are defeated, the one you killed second powers up and flies away. Phase 2 actually doesn't begin until the end of Night 2, where you have to fight the Demon Prince. I haven't been able to figure out if killing one demon or the other affects the Demon Prince fight, but it doesn't seem to in any meaningful way. Both demons from Night 1 use fire and poison damage pretty interchangeably. While this lowered complexity is a little less interesting than its Dark Souls 3 counterpart, I can't say that I'm mad because of the overall increased difficulty in the Great Hollow. I'm regularly getting to the end of Night 2 at maybe only level 12 or 13. Combine that with the reduced flask amount and you end up with a relatively balanced boss fight in both nights. The typical final arena for the Great Hollow is this really awesome tower reminiscent of the Divine Towers from Elden Ring, with this really wide open space and windows to look out at the expansive zone around you. It's my favorite final boss area of any of the Shifting Earth events. Knight Artorias is also another amazing addition to the boss roster with the DLC. He's been a staple of the series for over a decade now, and my biggest critique here is that he's only available to fight if you're doing the Dreglord expedition. I've already complained about these throwback bosses being available in such a limited way, but this one just feels like a real kick in the teeth. Artorias is almost at the level of being a franchise mascot, and seeing him relegated to only being available on what's probably the hardest expedition in the game is a real letdown. If I could have one major fix besides adding Shadow of the Erdtree weapons to the game, it'd be to unlock these throwback encounters to be available on all expeditions. Fans have been modding in boss rush modes for years now, so it absolutely blows my mind that developers have actually added a boss rush mode, but only to Sekiro and not to any games that came after. My biggest enjoyment of Nightreign is when it functions as a boss gauntlet mode. There are just way too many caveats to that format in this game for me to not wish it was better. Yes, I know that if I just played these games on PC, I could mod in a boss selector screen, and I'm sure I could play it as many times and with as much build variety as I wanted, but given that we know it's possible, like with Sekiro, I think it's still valid to question why it hasn't been added in subsequent releases. As a final note on the Great Hollow raid, I do think it's worth pointing out that each time I defeated the Balancers and the Dreglord, it was not from an expedition that used this Shifting Earth. Whether it's due to balancing or my own lack of knowledge, I've never finished the Great Hollow at level 15, and only rarely ended up with any kind of good loot. Each time I played this raid, I feel really busy, so my gut tells me there's some kind of balancing issue going on here. For once, I actually kind of agree with the community that the spacing is really weird and the curse from the crystals is way too punishing. My best success against the Balancers and the Dreglord was when I was using the standard limveld map, especially when I was using the Crater and Noclateo Shifting Earth. I'd like to explore the Great Hollow more and really get to learn it fluidly, but not for the purposes of finishing this video in any kind of timely manner and completing all of these boss encounters. I'd much rather do this raid when I know I'm fighting a more standard boss at the end of it, but right now, I don't think that's actually possible. In the end, I'm coming off on the slightly negative side for this new zone. It's sort of the opposite experience I had from the Elden Ring DLC. With Shadow of the Erdtree, I was initially really put off by the spike in difficulty, but the exploration and world design of the new map reeled me back in. With the Great Hollow, the difficulty and variety of the enemies is what I'm really excited about. It's the exploration and world design here that are leaving me feeling kind of disappointed. I really do think that the HP curse with the crystals is too much of a hindrance for me to really want to sink my teeth into exploring these different zones. I haven't even really had a chance to explore the Divine Towers by each castle and take on these miniaturized boss gauntlets because I spent so much time trying to break the curse that I only get through one or two of these fights in the tower before the end of Night 2. The Great Hollow is not a two thumbs down situation. It's more like a two thumbs kind of sideways, and I hope it gets tweaked a bit more in similar ways to how other mechanics have been tweaked to be just a little more forgiving. Until then, I'm probably going to try and stick with limveld as often as I can. Maybe now's a good time to talk about what's actually sitting at the end of this expansion, the Balancers and the Dreglord, and how they might just make up for some of that disappointment I'm feeling here. Hi there. Sticky note Nailsym here. In actually getting to fully explore one of the castle zones thanks to a player who really knew their way around, seriously, these castles would be neat to explore if I weren't on a time limit, but they are absolute mazes. I wouldn't have known where to go, and our third guy got lost, and we didn't see him again until the final boss fight. But we got to the top of the castle to find a golden hippopotamus that had the fucking Phase 2 porcupine quills from Shadow of the Erdtree. What is he doing up here? Why is this one version of the boss different from literally every other one I've been fighting for 6 months now? I don't have footage because I was actually just playing for fun at this time, but seriously, what the fuck? What a confusing addition to the game. I should be happy to get more expanded DLC content, but this is just chapping my ass a little bit. Okay, rant over. Let's get to the bosses. I had to get this out. I feel like I'm losing my mind a little bit. The Balancers might be my favorite big group fight in the entire FromSoft catalog. It's difficult for me to think of a single group fight that has ever been this fun. For the most part, they've only ever been mostly tolerable, even going back to Dark Souls 2. It's taken them a really long time to tweak this boss format into a way that doesn't really feel boring. Even into this game, fighting certain group encounters means either fighting a bunch of low-level enemies or getting absolutely smashed by 3 to 6 high-level enemies. After the Everdark Leaper fight, I thought I'd be soured on this format in Nightreign forever. The Balancers have officially proved me wrong on this front. For starters, the cool factor is just off the charts. The immediate impression is as if you're fighting all of the Valkyries of Valhalla at once. You'll tend to get a few to aggro to you, but their health is pretty manageable. They're not incredibly fragile, and they stagger pretty reliably, but they're still a very big damage threat with some really interesting moves that they can layer on top of each other. One might be charging up an AoE that has a very specific dodge timing, while the other is layering on spear strikes that have to be dodged much more quickly and frantically. If your timing is off for one or both of these, you're going to get punished. They'll also layer grab attacks in a way that's really satisfying, and the timing of which isn't super hard to learn. They almost never grab as just a single enemy, so if one charges up a grab attack that you dodge, even if you don't see any of them else on your screen, there's likely one behind you that's charging up a grab attack too. These always come in the same rhythm one after the other, so you can always reliably dodge, and often there'll have been a Valkyrie behind you lunging in for the kill. It makes you feel really big-brained when you get this dodge timing just right. Phase 2 of the fight begins when you've killed all the Valkyries for the first time. One of them will resurrect, change color, and then revive the other 8 to fight you as well. All of the Valkyries get much more aggressive and get additional attacks. This transition from Phase 1 to 2 is one of my favorite learning experiences in a fight. During Phase 1, you get to learn the standard types of attacks that you'll be encountering at a pretty manageable speed. Then, in Phase 2, they speed up and layer on at an absolute hellstorm. The grab attacks are terrifying. The main Valkyrie is a damage sponge, and when the group forms up to perform this layered AoE attack, it really does feel like they're bringing the sky down on top of you. The soundtrack is, like a lot of the others, just amazing. I want to give it a better listen now that I've defeated the boss, because it's really a unique and fitting addition to this roster. Later in December, FromSoft surprise dropped the Everdark fight for the Balancers, which for me, writing this script is both exciting and extremely frustrating. Anyway, the fight is pretty neat. Phase 1 is just the regular Valkyrie gang. Their attacks are similar to Phase 1 and 2 of the standard fight, but they feel a teeny bit more aggressive here. At least they don't do their big wave attacks. Maybe this is just me anticipating a more difficult fight. Killing all of these gals the first time around causes the final one to tear herself apart and shower the arena in blood, sending you and the Scooby Gang to Phase 2. Phase 2 is some Eldritch Horror Silent Hill shit. The corpses of the Valkyries rise from the blood-soaked earth and shamble around like the corpses revived by the Dreglord. It's as though the balance you disrupted caused the Valkyries to be corrupted by the dregs at the bottom of the corpse pile. They shriek and dart out at you, swinging wildly in a flurry of jabs and swings. They're still not hard to stagger, but they're even more aggressive than the standard Phase 2, and they can overwhelm you super easily in numbers. Occasionally, the shambling corpses will disappear to give rise to a giant worm creature headed by the primary Balancer. It'll dart around the map, spawn blood flowers all over the arena, and send massive bloody shockwaves out that can just decimate your health bar. This worm isn't even worth attacking. Your only objective here is to just survive until the rampage is over. Once the worm has had its fun for now, it disappears and the shambling corpses rise again to fuck your shit up. The Valkyries don't seem to have too many new attacks post-worm, but their aggression is still their biggest threat. Without high damaging weapons, this becomes a dangerous endurance fight. Their shrieks and strikes inflict you with blood loss, which can eat away at your health even faster than the Dreglord's rot if you're not careful. Some of their attack combos feel like Mesmer's combo, which is really fun to see and realize, but equally dangerous and hard to dodge. I really like the idea of this fight. I love the motif in these games of holy powers getting corrupted by some outer force and becoming this awful horror. And like with the Dreglord, that really comes through here. My issue is that in all my attempts, I either melted these enemies or I was barely keeping myself alive. Radahn's greatswords are especially broken here on Undertaker for their two-handed wide sweeps that can save you from being surrounded by staggering the balancers and just melting their health bar. Shields feel really helpful here, as you're likely to get caught off guard by enemies in your blind spots, and the extra protection helps a lot. I wasn't stuck on it for nearly as long as some of the other Everdark bosses, but aside from the initial shock of seeing the corpse versions, this fight is kinda boring. I don't consider Worm mode to be its own phase of the fight, just a modification of this phase too. If the balancers become any different post-Worm, it's not different enough for me to really notice. This massive tone shift for the fight does make me wonder something. Why aren't other Everdark fights this different? This Everdark is a massive difference in tone, feel, and pacing of the entire battle. Even my favorite bosses got weirdly simple Everdark fights like with Libra and Caligo. I guess you could say that Everdark Libra is a pretty massive departure, but it's still just throwing a bunch of NPC fights at the wall. It's not really Libra that's getting a lot of these changes. Everdark Pest and Dark Drift Knight are pretty different, but the more I'm thinking about it, a lot of fights are just an expanded Phase 2.5. With Balancers, it's an entirely different experience. I wonder now if some of the Everdark fights were rushed out the door to carry the content along until the DLC release. Maybe the DLC was supposed to drop earlier given its size, and there would have been a steady stream of content until that release. This could just be more conjecture on my part, but it does have me wishing some of these Everdark bosses had more to offer. With the Balancers, it's a very distinct and different experience from the standard encounter. I'm glad to get an Everdark version that seems to expand on the themes of the DLC, but I'm still not super keen to return to this expedition anytime soon. Okay, editor version coming in here to say that even though I'm coming down with a cold, I have to give an addendum to this fight before I lose the function of my larynx, probably tomorrow morning. Originally, like I said before, when I first completed this boss, I really thought I wouldn't want to come back to it. But I've run this expedition a few more times to write out this section, and the more I fought these Balancers, the more fun I found myself having. They're not the most challenging fight, but the cool and scary factors are just awesome. The Worm mode, while slightly prohibiting to most melee attacks, doesn't last more than 30 to 45 seconds, and it has a pretty predictable set of attacks to learn and react to, including my favorite little bunny hop dodge. I wonder if it feels less challenging because its punishments are less annoying. I'm reminded of the design philosophy of Dark Souls 2 here. There, a lot of encounters are large amounts of enemies to work with in a given space. Crowd control is much more important, and if you find yourself surrounded, it's because you've already made some mistake or you weren't managing that crowd correctly. With the Everdark Balancers, it's largely the same. You only usually get rushed down by one sprinting Balancer at a time. If you press the attack and take down the Balancer before the others rush you, that's one less that you have to worry about for a few seconds before it resurrects itself. This fun comes from trying to eliminate each Balancer individually while dodging attacks from a growing number of support enemies. This is a different challenge to one large or particularly strong enemy, like Mesmer. Funnily enough, his combos are really similar to the Balancers, but the telegraphs from the supporting Balancers are really loud and bright, and they have a limited number of attacks to learn, like less than 5 or so, I think. So while each Balancer is easily staggered, has low health, and not a lot of attacks, the challenge grows very quickly unless you take the initiative to take them down before you get overwhelmed. This boss's challenge is a really climactic battle without a lot of the frustrations I have from lesser Everdark fights. I also get the benefit of getting to take on DLC points of interest in Limveld or doing the Great Hollow raid, so I'm getting to do DLC content either way. I think of the 3 DLC final bosses we have access to at this time of recording, please God, don't do an Everdark Drakelord. I want to finish this, please. This one is actually the most replayable. It's not boring, but it's not nearly as exhausting as fighting the Drakelord. Plus, I get to talk about liking Dark Souls 2 for a bit here. If people have a problem with that, I'll have no choice but to make a whole video on Dark Souls 2 actually being really, really good just to spite you all. The Drakelord is only accessible after you've defeated the Balancers. This means that anyone you get matched with in multiplayer is most likely a pretty seasoned player at this point. You might think that this is all great, and I've definitely seen a lot of higher skilled players in my time with this boss, but this comes as a double-edged sword. With the DLC being only a couple of days old, the number of players who've purchased the DLC and beaten the balancers and are matchmaking to fight the Dreglord is really low from day to day. I had multiple attempts at this boss where I'd get paired with the same person that I had just played with in the previous attempt. This might be kind of fun in a lot of cases, and over the years I've played a lot of multiplayer games where I'd occasionally get matched up with somebody from previous times, and it'd feel like a real treat getting to see an old friend again. But there's very little sense of camaraderie here between players, mainly because there's just no voice chat. Additionally, and I'm really hoping that this is just my first few days experience, I have had players leave the expedition early almost every single attempt at fighting this boss, with these players generally being of a higher skill because of their displayed confidence in fighting other bosses. You get a sense of frustration from them at some optimal play. They spam markers, they don't stick with the team, and they get mad at you when they're the ones that are going off on their own and dying. Now look, I'm guilty of this too from time to time. I get frustrated as well, but this is really just an unsolvable problem with a game like this. It's gotten a little bit better since FromSoft tuned down the damage of bosses as somebody leaves your party to that lower party count, but that doesn't solve the problem, it only mitigates it. Combine that with the fact that a lot of my runs to this boss have been on the Great Hollow map, it means that this boss has been one of the hardest to even get to in my entire time with the game, let alone beating it. When I finally did manage to get to the Dreglord, I was treated to what has become one of the favorite bosses I have seen in this game to date. The Dreglord represents all the souls that have fallen to the night. Maybe the Dreglord was an attempt at recruitment to the night by Hellstore that went a little bit wrong. Perhaps the infusion of the Scarlet Rot was too much to control, as we know that Rot is a blessing from an outer god. His title names him as a traitor. This writhing mass of flesh coalesces into a gory monstrosity with clear sentience. As you fight, the Dreglord uses his innate power of the Scarlet Rot to revive his fellow fallen souls and draw them straight up out of the ground. These tortured victims don't harass you too much, but they can hurt you if you're not careful. Thankfully, killing them also helps to charge ultimate attacks. Eventually, the Dreglord summons all his strength to cause the sky to erupt with a putrid rain of the Scarlet Rot. As aggressive as he is, his combos aren't all that hard to predict. The trouble comes with that constant Scarlet Rot damage chipping away at your health. A good scholar can cure their whole team, but this is still a complication that you have to prepare for. The Dreglord's health bar is absolutely massive as well. This is an endurance fight on an ultimate scale. While I was watching some of my footage back, my wife even noticed that even when I was using Marika's hammer with the Undertaker, I was barely doing any damage. Strigas has multiple large AoE blasts and will buff his own attack strength over time. Doing enough damage seems to negate this buff, like you're hitting him hard enough to dampen his rage just a little bit. Scholars can also analyze the monster to lower his damage further, keeping the fight almost fair. Defeating the traitor causes a similar transition to Hellstore. Where he was taken over by the power of the night itself, Strigas is possessed by pure rage and instinct, becoming even faster and more aggressive. Those tortured souls don't reappear, as if he's absorbed their power like the Abyss Watchers in Dark Souls 3. That consolidated power lets Strigas build massive pillars of refuse to swing and leap from, darting back and forth at a blistering speed. His fight is basically a 4-phase battle, probably the longest fight of any FromSoft game, with each phase feeling like a clear escalation and requiring quick learning of his new combos. His massive health bar makes each phase of each health bar one you have to contend with. There's just no way to melt your way out of having to deal with each of his forms. This leaping swipe, for example, can have a different number of attacks in the combo, requiring you to be able to recognize the incredibly brief windup from all the way across the arena. Hesitate for a moment and he's already got you. As this fight went on, it felt to me like a mix of Slave Knight Gale from Dark Souls 3 and the Orphan of Kos in Bloodborne, two fights at the extreme end of difficulty for their respective games, and also two of my series favorites. As I came to feel this, I found myself just intuiting a lot of the combos. While faster than those games by far, this boss feels right at home among my favorites in the series for the same reasons. The combination of rampaging swipes and deliberate swings of the staff, but with the added need to manage the buffing and debuffing. I even said to my wife during this game, I don't care if I even lose here, I'm just having so much fun. None of the other bosses made me feel this way in the entire game. Now, I'll admit, my team did manage to absolutely score in loot drops in Naglateo. We all had legendary weapons, the power of the Natural Born, and at least one Wending Grace each. But I still had 2 Wending Graces at the end of the night, so I feel like I still accomplished something here. To my 2 teammates, yes, I may have clutched the very end, but I wouldn't have gotten even nearly that close were it not for all of us just locking the fuck in. May your pillows always be cool and your tendies extra crispy. This whole expedition and finale was everything I love about this game distilled into 45 minutes of just kicking ass. If you're like me and you've had your fill of the Great Hollow, you might want to go back to the standard map for just some old-fashioned fun. Well, hopefully you're as pleased as I was when I saw that the point of interest in Limveld have also gotten a pretty substantial refresh with this new DLC. If you're running the Balancer or Drakelord expedition, there's new castle types that have been added to take the place of some castle and cathedral ruins throughout the map. They still have the same sets of elemental focuses, but their layouts are way different. I'm not sure that I've seen every single iteration of these, but the ones I'll show on the screen here is the one that adds a poison swamp. Glad we finally got one of those in here. Instead of going up to the top where I'd find the normal castle bosses here, I go down, down, down under the earth to also fight new bosses, here shown as the Kindred of Rot. I'm really happy that the DLC and its updates refreshed this map a little bit. Any chance for a change of scenery and additional boss encounters is, to me, a change that's welcome. Kindred of Rot aren't my favorite boss by any stretch of the imagination, but it's better than fighting another fucking Miranda flower. It seems as though the other Shifting Earth didn't get any kind of update, but since they change around so much, I don't mind that. They provide enough variety on their own, and these haven't grown stale for me the way the standard points of interest have. It's got me at least a little motivated to try and explore again. Limveld also gets a new field encounter in the form of the Balancers if you're specifically running the Drakelord expedition. You'll get a message that the Balancers are coming, and then your team is going to get scattered across the map to different POIs with your flasks dropped to 0. Each player at their point of interest must kill a Balancer that's taken up residence there. Each one you kill negates the flask reduction by 1. They're not super hard to kill on their own, but you're also going to be surrounded by the regular enemies of the area that now have a massive health boost. Characters that don't rely on high damage output can really struggle here, and one of the POIs is almost always in the path of the first closing circle, at least when I've played. Failing this encounter leaves your flask severely reduced permanently. From what I've seen, the community feels kind of mixed on this. I find it fun, but like the Augur fight, the closing in circle can make this a really frustrating encounter that tends to happen way too early to be fun every time it happens. So where does that leave me feeling on the DLC as a whole product? I'm thinking about it more and more since finishing it, and I think I'm coming away pretty positive. I don't like assigning numerical scores to these games, but I think there's just so much offered here as a package. Usually with games, I just rank them more with how worth it they are at full price. I think 2 new main bosses, 2 new characters, 10-ish Night 1 and 2 bosses, and a whole new explorable map make for a pretty good package at $15 US. The deluxe edition of the game that includes the DLC is still under $60. While I initially felt negative on the Great Hollow map, I think it was more because the level was the biggest roadblock keeping me from seeing the final bosses, which I always consider the most important additions to FromSoft DLC. Now that I've seen and defeated both, I think it's time for me to really get to know that map. I think my feelings might change on it over time. The 2 new characters also gave me my favorites to play with, and one that always makes me happy to see on my team. The runs feel a little fresher now with all the variety they've added. If you like Nightreign, the DLC is more than worth it. And with that, I think we've pretty much seen everything. And it only took me... Oh my god. Okay. Let's try to be brief here. This has gotten completely out of hand for a first video. Jesus.
It's hard to believe we've come this far, don't you think? Let's greet the end with a smile.
Elden Ring Nightreign isn't the best Souls game. I wouldn't say to start with this one if you've never played one of these games before. The pacing is just too fast to come into completely fresh off the street and learn while having a fun time. I think Elden Ring is a much better jumping on point where you can take the time to learn the Souls-like format at your own pace. It's also now completely obvious and silly that these games just need to have a boss rush mode like Sekiro. The fights in Nightreign are mostly great, but now that I've beaten them all multiple times, the whole gameplay loop itself just feels like the longest run back in history. But taking this game on its own, I can't say I haven't had a blast. At just over 220 hours now, I feel like I could put the game down for a while. I could come back in a few weeks and run an expedition or two to get that feeling of Souls combat without committing to a whole new character if I were playing a different game. And I think I'll have good reason to return as well. I really doubt FromSoft is just going to stop after one DLC pack. Even if it's more Everdark editions or new modes like Deep of Night, these games get a lot of love for a long time, so I don't think 6 months of post-release support is all we're going to get here. On that list of support, I pray to the Erdtree that somebody finally adds crossplay or some kind of voice chat. I'd be happy with either. I don't know if it's fair to expect either of these since neither has been a mechanic of the series in the past, but maybe now it's time to learn that. If Duskbloods is as multiplayer focused as Nightreign, and it isn't built with either of these functionalities, I won't be able to feel this generous about it. This game is a trial for a lot, so I can be forgiving, but fool me twice. This game has received a heavy amount of critique that it largely reuses assets, from enemies to weapons and even inspiring a lot of the architecture around Limveld. While this game might have a similar coat of paint to Elden Ring, I think the bones of this game are still wildly different. In going back to Shadow of the Erdtree to gather some boss footage, I was struck by how slow I felt compared to Nightreign. The sprint felt like a jog, and even some boss enemies felt slower in Shadow of the Erdtree than they do in Nightreign. Maybe I should actually go back and play that DLC again because so many of these world bosses that used to make me tremble in my cowboy boots just don't anymore. I miss my little yak pal and our long strolls on the beach. With Duskbloods on the horizon, I think Nightreign is going to be the best practice grounds to get ready, both as players and for the developers as well. Things are still pretty cagey as far as details go for that release, but as always, guys, I'm going to be seated day one. Nightreign has shown me that FromSoft can get pretty weird with the format and still make a game I can sink hundreds of hours into. Elden Ring Nightreign is a game worthy of that IP and worthy to stand among the rest of the series. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. I hope the first video for this channel was an entertaining watch. If my threat of a Dark Souls 2 video didn't scare you off, consider subscribing. I intend to make at least a few Souls-related videos, but I've got lots of other ideas for this year, so stay tuned. You can also find me at the social links down in the description. I stream very occasionally, but I hope to have a consistent schedule in the future if interest is there. I'll see you all next time.